The Misadventures of Ms Wiz by Terence Blacker. Read by Helen Lederer.
Ms Wiz Spells Trouble. Chapter 1. A New Arrival. Most teachers are strange, and the teachers at St Barnabas School were no exception. Yet it's almost certain that none of them, not Mr Gilbert, the headmaster, who liked to pick his nose during assembly, not Mrs Hicks, who talked to her teddies in class, not Miss Gomez, who smoked cigarettes in the lavatory, none of them was quite as odd as the new form teacher for Class 3. Some of the children in Class 3 thought she was a witch. Others said she was a hippie. A few of them thought she was just a bit mad, but they all agreed that there had never been anyone quite like her at St Barnabas before. This is her story. I wonder what you think she was. As soon as their new teacher walked into the classroom on the first day of term, the children of Class 3 sensed that there was something different about her. She was quite tall, with long black hair and bright green eyes. She wore tight jeans and a purple blouse. Her fingers were decorated with several large rings and black nail varnish. She looked as if she were on her way to a disco, not teaching at a school. Most surprising of all, she wasn't frightened. Class 3 was known in the school as the problem class. It had a reputation for being difficult and noisy, for having what was called a disruptive element. Miss Jones, their last teacher, had left the school in tears, but none of that seemed to worry this strange-looking new teacher. "My name is Miss Wisdom," she said in a quiet but firm voice. "So what do you say to me every morning when I walk in?" "Good morning, Miss Wisdom," said Class 3 unenthusiastically. "Wrong," said the teacher with a flash of her green eyes. "You say, 'Hi, Ms Wiz.'" Jack, who was one of Class 3's disruptive element, giggled at the back of the class. "Yo," he said in a silly American accent. "Why, hi, Ms Wiz." Caroline, the class dreamer, was paying attention for a change. "Why is it Ms, she asked. "Well," said Ms Wiz, "I'm not Mrs. because I'm not married, thank goodness. And I'm not Miss because I think Miss sounds silly for a grown woman, don't you?" "Not as silly as Ms," muttered Katrina, who liked to find fault wherever possible. "And why Wiz?" asked a rather large boy sitting in the front row. It was Podge, who was probably the most annoying and certainly the greediest boy in the class. "Wiz?" said Ms Wiz with a mysterious smile. "Just you wait and see." Ms Wiz reached inside a big leather bag that she had placed beside her desk. She pulled out a china cat. "That," she said, placing the cat carefully on her desk, "is my friend Hecate, the cat. She's watching you all the time. She sees everything and hears everything. She's my spy." Ms Wiz turned to the blackboard. "Weird," muttered Jack. An odd hissing sound came from the china cat. Its eyes lit up like torches. "Hecate sees you even when my back is turned," said Miss Wiz, who now faced the class. "Will the person who said weird spell it, please?" Everyone stared at Jack, who blushed. "I-T," he stammered. No one laughed. W-I... "Wrong," said Miss Wiz. W-E-I-R-D. "If you don't know how to spell a word, Jack, don't use it." She patted the china cat. "Good girl, Hecate," she said. "How did she know my name?" whispered Jack. The new teacher smiled. "Children, remember one thing. Ms Wiz knows everything. Now," she said briskly, "pay attention, please. Talking of spelling, I'm going to give you a first lesson in casting spells." "Oh, great," said Katrina grumpily. "Now we've got a witch for a teacher." Hecate the cat hissed angrily. "No, Katrina, not a witch," said Ms Wiz sharply. "We don't call them witches these days. It gives people the wrong idea. We call them paranormal operatives. Now, any suggestions for our first spell?" Podge put up his hand immediately. "Could we turn our crayons into lollipops, please, miss?" he asked. "No," said Miss Wiz. "Spells are not for personal greed." "How about turning Class 2 into frogs?" asked Katrina. nor are they for revenge. There will be no unpleasant spells around here while I'm your teacher, said Ms Wiz, before adding, almost as an afterthought, unless they're deserved, of course. She looked out of the window. In the playground, Mr Brown, the school caretaker, was sweeping up leaves. Please draw the playground, said Ms Wiz. Imagine it without any leaves. The best picture will create the spell. Almost for the first time in living memory, Class 3 worked in complete quiet. Katrina didn't complain that someone had nicked her pencil. Caroline managed to concentrate on her work. Podge forgot to look in his trouser pocket for one last sweet. Not a single paper pellet was shot across the room by Jack. At the end of the lesson, Ms Wiz looked at the drawings carefully. Well, they're all quite good, she said eventually, but I think I like Caroline's the best. She took Caroline's drawing and carefully taped it to the window. Please close your eyes while I cast the spell, she said. There was a curious humming noise as Class 3 sat, eyes closed in silence. Open, said Ms Wiz after a few seconds. Regard Caroline's work. The children looked at Caroline's drawing. It looked exactly as it had before, except that it was steaming slightly. Hey, look at the playground, shouted Katrina. Everyone looked out of the window. To their amazement, the leaves on the ground had disappeared. Mr Brown stood by his wheelbarrow, scratching his head. Weird, said Jack. Very weird indeed. Chapter 2. Ms Wiz is magic. Yes, I'm afraid she is a bit odd, sighed the headmaster, Mr Gilbert, as he took tea one morning with Miss Gomez and Mrs Hicks in the staff common room. Those jeans, sniffed Miss Gomez, and I never thought I'd live to see black nail varnish at St Barnabas. But you have to admit she seems to have Class 3 under control, said Mr Gilbert. That's a whole week she's been here, and not one child has been sent to my study. Not one window has been broken. Mrs Hicks stirred her tea disapprovingly. It won't last, she said. The disruptive element will get the better of her. And there are some very strange noises coming from that classroom. I'd keep an eye on the situation if I were you, headmaster, said Miss Gomez. Mr Gilbert sighed. Yes, he said wearily. That's what I'll do. Keep an eye on the situation. The fact is that Class 3, including the disruptive element, were having the time of their lives. Every lesson with Ms Wiz was different. Now, Class 3, she would say, I'm going to teach you something rather unusual. But remember, what happens in this classroom is our secret. The magic only works if nobody except us knows about it. Surprisingly, Class 3 agreed. So no one, not even parents or other children at the school, had any idea of the strange things that happened to Class 3. They never heard how Caroline's picture of the playground saved Mr Brown a morning's work. They never heard how Jack's desk moved to the front of the class all by itself when Hecket spotted him talking at the back. They never heard how Katrina flew around the class 3 times on a vacuum cleaner after she had complained that Ms Wiz couldn't be a real witch, paranormal operative, because she didn't ride a broomstick. They never heard about the nature lesson when the class met Herbert, a pet rat that Ms Wiz kept up her sleeve. But they did hear about the day when Podge became the hero of the class. Nobody could keep that a secret. Once every term, Class 3 played a football match against a team from a school nearby, called Brackenhurst. It was a very important game, and everyone from St Barnabas gathered in the playground to watch. Last term, Class 3 had lost 10-0. That was because Miss Jones picked all the wimps, explained Jack. Because she was a wimp herself, said Caroline. The rest of the class agreed noisily. I'll be manager, shouted Jack over the din. Ms Wiz held up her hands like a wizard about to cast a spell. I'll be manager, she said firmly. But you don't know anything about football, said Jack. Ms Wiz knows everything, said Caroline. Creep, muttered Katrina. Hecket the cat hissed angrily. All right, Hecket, said Katrina quickly. I take it back. My team, said Miss Wiz, is Jack, Simon, Katrina, Alex, and... She looked around the classroom and saw Podge's arm waving wildly. "No, Miss Wiz," several of the class shouted at once. "Not Podge, he's useless." "And Podge." There was a groan from around the classroom. "Here comes another hammering," said Jack gloomily. For a while during the game that afternoon, it looked as though Jack's prediction had been right. After 3 minutes, Brackenhurst had already scored twice. Podge had been a disaster, falling over his own feet every time the ball came near him. "Serves that Miss Cleverclogs right," said Mrs. Hicks, who was watching the match with Miss Gomez. "Look at her, jumping up and down like that, making herself look foolish in front of the kiddies. Anybody would think she was a child herself." "It's embarrassing, that's what it is," agreed Miss Gomez. "Do something," said Caroline, who was standing next to Ms. Wiz. "And what do you suggest, Caroline?" asked Ms. Wiz, whose normally pale face was now quite red. "You know," whispered Caroline. "Something special." "Oh, all right," sighed Ms. Wiz. "I suppose a little magic wouldn't hurt." At that moment, Podge blundered into one of Brackenhurst's players and knocked him over. Mr. Gilbert, who was referee, blew hard on his whistle for a free kick against Class 3, but not a sound came out. In fact, the only sound to be heard was a faint humming noise from the direction of Ms. Wiz. "That's better," said Caroline. Brackenhurst's players were still waiting for the whistle to blow when Podge set off with the ball at his feet. He took 2 paces and booted it wildly. It was heading several feet wide of the Brackenhurst goal when, to everyone's astonishment, the ball changed direction and, as if it had a life of its own, flew into the back of the net. For a moment there was a stunned silence. Then Ms. Wiz could be heard cheering on her team once more. "What a shot!" she shouted. "Nice one, Podge!" "Appalling behaviour," muttered Mrs. Hicks. From then on the game altered completely. Not even in his wildest dreams, when he had scored the winning goal for Spurs in the FA Cup final, had Podge played so well. Soon even Jack was shouting, "Give it to Podge! Give the ball to Podge!" while the Brackenhurst players were screaming, "Stop the fat one! Trip him, someone!" But nobody could stop Podge. Playing as if he were under a spell, he scored 3 goals to give Class 3 a great 3-2 victory. After the game, the class gathered around Ms. Wiz, shouting, cheering, and singing songs. "So much for her having her class under control," said Mrs. Hicks. "They may win matches, but Class 3 are worse than ever with the new teacher." Miss Gomez had hurried over to Mr. Gilbert. "Just look at that, headmaster," she said, pointing to Class 3, who were now singing "Ms. Wiz's Magic" at the top of their voices. "It's nothing short of anarchy." But Mr. Gilbert wasn't listening. He was still studying his new whistle and wondering why it hadn't worked. Chapter 3. An Extremely Mathematical Owl. "This is all very difficult," said Mr. Gilbert, puffing nervously on his pipe. He was sitting in his study with Ms. Wiz, who at this moment was looking at him with an annoying little smile on her face. "Very awkward. You see, Miss Wiz, there have been, well, complaints." "Goodness," said Miss Wiz brightly. "What on earth about?" Mr. Gilbert fumbled around with his pipe. Why was he feeling so nervous? Of course, he was always uneasy with women, but there were lots of women who were more frightening than Ms. Wiz. Mrs. Gilbert, for a start. The thought of his wife made the headmaster sit up in his armchair and try again. "Firstly, there have been complaints about the way you look," he said, glancing at Ms. Wiz. She was actually wearing black lipstick today. "You find something wrong with the way I look?" asked Ms. Wiz, who was beginning to be confused by this conversation. No, said Mr. Gilbert, tapping his pipe on an ashtray. I don't, personally. Then, he said, quickly changing the subject, there's what you teach, your history lessons, for example. But Class 3 loves history, said Miss Wiz. We're doing the French Revolution at the moment. So I gather, said Mr. Gilbert. The entire class was walking around the playground yesterday shouting, "Behead the aristocrats!" I'm told that Jack was carrying a potato on the end of a sharp stick. Ms. Wiz laughed. They're very keen, she said. Perhaps you could move on to some other part of history. Nice history, said the headmaster. 1066, the Armada, King Alfred and the cakes. Oh, no, said Miss Wiz. We already have our next project. May I know what it is? Asked Mr. Gilbert uneasily. Certainly, said Ms. Wiz. The Great Fire of London. The headmaster gulped. Mrs. Hicks and Miss Gomez had been right. Ms. Wiz spelt trouble. Perhaps, he said, you could concentrate on some other subject for the time being. Of course, said Ms. Wiz. We'll try a spot of maths for a while. Mr. Gilbert smiled for the first time that morning. Perfect, he said. Maths, he thought to himself after Ms. Wiz had left his study. That couldn't cause trouble, could it? Now, Class 3, said Ms. Wiz that afternoon. I'm going to test you on your 9 times table, multiplication and division. There was a groan around the classroom. Nobody liked the 9 times table. And to help me, continued Ms. Wiz, I've brought my friend Archimedes. She reached inside her desk and brought out a large white owl. Arch is what they call a bit of a number cruncher. He loves his tables, she said, putting the owl on top of the blackboard. Cats, rats, and now owls, muttered Katrina. This place gets more like a zoo every day. Archie is a barn owl, said Miss Wiz, ignoring Katrina. An extremely mathematical barn owl. Place the waste paper basket beneath him, please, Caroline. Why, Miss Wiz? Asked Caroline. Wait and see, said Miss Wiz. Caroline put the waste paper basket beneath Archie, who was now looking around the classroom, blinking wisely. Now, Podge, said Miss Wiz, tell Archie what 5 9s are. 45, said Podge. Twoo, went Archie. That means correct, said Miss Wiz. Simon, 9 9s. 81, said Simon. Twoo! Now, Jack, said Miss Wiz, let's try division. A boy has 108 marbles. He divides them between his 9 friends. What does that make? It makes him a wally for giving away all his marbles, said Jack. Archie looked confused. Try again, Jack, said Miss Wiz patiently. 11. Class 3 looked at Archie expectantly. Without a sound, the owl lifted its tail and did something very nasty into the waste paper basket beneath him. Ugh, gross, said the children. He's done a... The correct word is guano, said Miss Wiz. Jack? 10, said Jack. Archie lifted his tail. 8. Archie did it again. How does he keep doing that? Asked Podge. Miss Wiz shrugged. He's well trained, she said. We better have another basket standing by, said Katrina. Jack's never going to get it. He'd better, said Miss Wiz firmly. Every time Archie is obliged to do his guano, it means 50 lines. Jack groaned. Outside the door, Mrs. Hicks and Miss Gomez were listening carefully. They had left their classes with some reading work and were determined to catch the new teacher doing something wrong. Listen to that noise, said Miss Gomez. It's an absolute disgrace. Let's take a look through the window from the playground, said Mrs. Hicks. Moments later, the 2 teachers were watching in amazement as Jack struggled to give Archie the correct answer. There's a bird on the blackboard, whispered Miss Gomez. It's going to the lavatory, gasped Mrs. Hicks. In a bin. I can't believe my eyes. They were just pressing their noses to the window pane to get a closer look when Ms. Wiz glanced up. Those at the front of the class could hear a slight hum coming from her direction. Miss Gomez, said Mrs. Hicks. My nose! It's stuck to the glass. Mine too, cried Miss Gomez, trying to pull back from the window pane. Ouch! That hurts! It was at that moment that the bell rang for afternoon break. Soon the teachers were surrounded by laughing children. Don't just stand there, you horrible children, screamed Mrs. Hicks. Get help, quickly! No need, said Miss Wiz, who had joined the children in the playground. She tapped the glass. Miss Gomez and Mrs. Hicks fell back, free at last. It must have been the frost, said Ms Wiz with an odd little smile. Frost, said Miss Gomez, rubbing her nose. At this time of year? Don't talk daft. It's only September, said Mrs Hicks. Yes, said Ms Wiz. What funny old weather we've been having, don't you think? Chapter 4. Herbert takes a wrong turning. It was during an art lesson that Class 3 were first given an idea where Ms Wiz came from. She had asked the children to draw an imaginary building. The project was called The House of My Dreams. Jack drew a house that looked like Wembley Stadium. It had a football ground in the living room, and all the walls were slanted like skateboard ramps. Caroline drew the mansion that she would have when she became a film star. It had a huge lawn and swimming pool. In every room there was a cocktail cabinet for drinks. Podge drew Buckingham Palace made out of milk chocolate and fudge. Katrina drew a strange dark cottage in a wood. Cats with shining eyes stood guard on each side of the front door, and bats flew in and out of its old thatched roof. She called it Ms Wiz's Magic Cottage. When Katrina finished the picture, Ms Wiz laughed. It's lovely, she said, but not at all like where I really live. Where do you live? Asked Katrina. The entire class grew quiet. Somehow no one had ever dared ask Ms Wiz about herself before. I live in a flat a long, long way away, said Ms Wiz, at a place where almost certainly none of you have been. It's on the outskirts of town. Can we come and visit you during the holidays? Asked Jack. During the holidays, said Ms Wiz, I'm doing other things. That's my job, to go wherever a little magic is needed. Wherever, she smiled, things need shaking up a little. You've certainly shaken things up at St Barnabas, said Katrina. Does that mean you'll be leaving us soon? Ms Wiz smiled. Katrina, I'll only leave you when you no longer need me. For a moment there was silence in Class 3. Then Podge put up his hand. If you live so far away, he asked, how do you get to school every day? Do you fly in your vacuum cleaner? No, said Ms Wiz. I come by bus. If Ms Wiz was a little more serious than usual that afternoon, it was because she was thinking of the evening ahead of her. It was parents' evening. Ms Wiz liked being with children. She didn't even mind being with teachers, but the idea of a whole evening spent in the company of parents made her feel tired already. I must remember to keep my spells under control, she said to herself as she waited for the first parent to arrive. Adults aren't like children. Magic seems to upset them. The door opened. I'm Harris, said a large man in a suit, who was the first parent to arrive. He shook Ms Wiz firmly by the hand. Peter's dad. This, he nodded curtly towards a nervous-looking woman standing a pace behind him, is Mother. Peter. Ms Wiz's mind raced. Who was Peter? Of course, that was Podge's real name. Peter is doing well this term, she said, glancing at her notes. We're not happy, said Mr Harris firmly. Isn't that right, Mother? It is, said Mrs Harris. We're not happy at all. The lad's gone strange on us, continued Mr Harris. Always got his head in a book, or talking about school, asking us questions about this and that when his mother and I are trying to watch telly. Questions all the time, said Mrs Harris. Yak, 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 said Mr Harris. I'm a busy man. I work at the town hall. I want to relax of an evening, not answer questions from my own flesh and blood. That's your job. Ms Wiz smiled. Perhaps it's a good sign that he's interested in... He's never been interested before. Tea, telly, bed was our way. Nothing wrong with that. Mr Harris leant forward angrily. I've said to Mother, and I'll say it to you, I smell a rat. For a horrible moment, Ms Wiz thought he had discovered Herbert, who was asleep up her sleeve. And when Cuthbert Harris smells a rat, heads will roll. Come on, Mother, I'm off. Mr Harris stood up and, without another word, walked towards the door. Was it an accident that a banana skin had been left on the floor? Or was it a touch of Ms Wiz magic after all? Whoa! With a sickening crash, Mr Harris landed on the floor in a heap. Oh, Cuthbert, said Mrs. Harris. "Your best suit." Podge's father stood up, red-faced. "Right, that's it," he said as he dusted himself down. "Town Hall's going to hear of this. Heads will roll." Miss Wiz sighed as the door slammed behind Mr. and Mrs. Harris. Yes, she definitely preferred children to parents. Miss Wiz was not often angry, but when a few days after Parents' Evening, Mr. Gilbert brought a school inspector from the town hall into the classroom, there was an unusual sharpness in her tone when she addressed the class. "Now sit up, Class 3, she said, after the headmaster had left the school inspector sitting at a little desk at the back of the class. "Remember, we're being inspected by the town hall." The school inspector pursed his lips and made a note on the pad in front of him. It was a quiet lesson without, of course, a hint of magic. Even Heket the cat remained hidden in Ms. Wiz's bag. Unfortunately, nobody had told Herbert that Class 3 was being inspected, and Herbert, as luck would have it, decided on this particular moment to explore the classroom. After a few minutes of the lesson, he had discovered a new tunnel. It was warm and dark, like a very inviting old-fashioned chimney. Who could blame him for wanting to explore it? Rats like chimneys. How was he to know that he was climbing up the left leg of the school inspector's trousers? At first, the school inspector twitched. Then he shifted nervously in his seat. Then, as Herbert edged his way past his knee and upwards, the school inspector stood up. Oh, he said, patting his thigh. "What the... Oh! He hopped around the classroom. It was then that Herbert decided the chimney was moving around rather too much for comfort and made for the safety of the school inspector's underpants. "Oh!" The school inspector tore at his belt, jumped out of his trousers and ran from the classroom. Class 3 watched in amazement as the half-naked figure sprinted across the playground, out of the school gates and down the road. Relieved that the earthquake had passed, Herbert emerged nervously from the school inspector's trousers on the classroom floor. "Oh, Herbert," said Ms. Wiz, "you've done it now." Chapter 5. An Absolute Disgrace. Mr. Gilbert was in a muddle. You might think that Mr. Gilbert was always in a muddle, but this was the biggest muddle he had ever been in since he became headmaster of St. Barnabas. He was in such a muddle that his bald head had developed ugly red blotches. His attention would wander during lessons. He had even stopped picking his nose during assembly. "I'm on the horns of a dilemma," he told Mrs. Gilbert one evening. "People keep telling me that Ms. Wiz is a disaster. Miss Gomez and Mrs. Hicks say she's a troublemaker. The school inspector says her classroom is a health hazard. Mr. Harris says heads will roll. They all want me to suspend her before the end of term prize-giving next week." "Suspend her then, Henry," said Mrs. Gilbert. "What's the problem?" "The problem is that the children of Class 3 have won all the prizes this term. It's incredible. That sleepy Caroline has won the art prize. Jack has won the maths prize. The A for Attitude award for good behaviour has gone to Katrina, of all people. Even the appalling Podge has won a commendation for his story, The Enchanted Fudge Cake with a Thick Creamy Milk Chocolate Filling. How on earth can I say, 'Well done, everyone in Class 3, and by the way, I'm suspending your teacher'?" "Well, you better do what you think is best," said Mrs. Gilbert, "but don't allow yourself to be bullied this time." "Of course not," said Mr. Gilbert. "You know where I stand on bullying." "Let me guess," said Mrs. Gilbert. "On the horns of a dilemma?" "Precisely," said Mr. Gilbert. "Is it true that you're going to be suspended?" asked Katrina the next day in class. "Ever since the school inspector lost his trousers, Mr. Gilbert's been giving you some very funny looks." "So have Miss Gomez and Mrs. Hicks," said Jack. "They look positively happy." "My dad's smiling a lot," said Podge, "and that's never a good sign." "Never you mind about me," said Miss Wiz. "I can look after myself." "Yeah," said Simon, "you can magic 'em. That would show 'em." "What have I always said? No unpleasant spells," said Miss Wiz. "Oh, Miss," said Podge, "couldn't you just use a bit of magic? Just one little spell on Mr. Gilbert. Maybe you could change him into a human being, suggested Jack. There were cheers around the classroom. Ms. Wiz held up her hands. Class 3 were quiet. No, she said. I refuse to listen to rumours. If the headmaster no longer requires my services, there's nothing to be done about it. Oh, yes, there is, said Jack, which is how Class 3's great plan came into being. End-of-term prize-giving was the most important event of the term for St. Barnabas. It took place on the last day before the holidays, and everybody was there. On the platform in the school hall sat Mr. Gilbert, the school inspector, all the teachers, and the Lady Mayoress, a large, impressive woman who was wearing a large, impressive hat. In the audience were the children with their parents. Mr. Gilbert had just finished his end-of-term speech, which, give or take a couple of pathetic jokes, was the same as every end-of-term speech he had made for the last 10 years. Now, he said, I would like to ask the Lady Mayoress, Mr. Gilbert gave a simpering little bow in her direction, to present the prizes. First, the art prize to Caroline Smith of Class 3. There was polite applause as Caroline collected her prize. The maths prize has been won by Jack Beddoes of Class 3. Jack collected his prize, giving a modest wave to his supporters from the platform. The A for Attitude Award for good behaviour, Mr. Gilbert tried to keep the disbelief out of his voice, to Katrina O'Brien of Class 3. Katrina actually gave a little curtsy to the Lady Mayoress as she was presented with her award. And specially commended for his essay, The Enchanted Fudge Cake with a Thick Creamy Milk Chocolate Filling, Peter Harris of Class 3. Podge climbed the steps to the platform, but instead of collecting his prize from the Lady Mayoress, he took the microphone from the astonished headmaster. Everyone in Class 3 wants to thank Ms. Wiz, he announced. She's the best teacher we've ever had. Give me that microphone, boy, said Mr. Gilbert, chasing Podge around the stage. We hope she never, ever leaves, shouted Podge. Don't we, Class 3? At that moment, the children of Class 3 stood up and started cheering. Several of them produced banners reading, Ms. Wiz is magic, and no sack for Ms. Wiz, which had been smuggled into the hall. You can stop that right now, Peter, said Podge's father, Mr. Harris, advancing towards the platform. I'm going to give you a proper larruping when you get home. There was a humming sound from the back of the stage where Ms. Wiz was sitting quietly. Suddenly, Mr. Harris had turned into a strange pig-like animal. Goodness, said Miss Gomez, he's turned into a warthog. Surely not, said Mrs. Hicks. Warthogs don't have those funny little tusks. He looks more like a wild boar to me. Never mind that, shouted Mr. Gilbert. We have a full-scale riot on a... Bah! In a flash, there was a sheep standing in the headmaster's place. By now, the entire school was chanting, We want Ms. Wiz! We want Ms. Wiz! Miss Wiz stood up, and Podge gave her the microphone. I think, she said firmly, that we should continue prize-giving in half an hour. I'd like to see Class 3 in their classroom now, please. She made her way through the audience, which was now silent. Phone the police, Miss Gomez, hissed Mrs. Hicks. Ms. Wiz glanced over her shoulder. Suddenly, where Miss Gomez and Mrs. Hicks had been standing, there were 2 grey geese, making a furious gobbling noise. That was very kind of you, Class 3, said Ms. Wiz, when all the children had gathered in the classroom. But the fact is, I'm leaving St. Barnabas anyway. There was silence in the classroom. Why? Asked Katrina eventually. After all that, muttered Podge. I go where magic is needed, said Miss Wiz, where things need livening up. Today you've proved that you no longer need me. You're the best class in the school. We won't be without you, said Caroline. Yes, you will, said Miss Wiz. Wait and see. We'll miss you, said Jack, serious for once. No, you won't, because... The class looked expectantly at Ms. Wiz. Caroline managed to stop sniffling at the back of the class. "Because I'll be back," said Ms Wiz. "When? Where? Next term?" Ms Wiz held up her hands. "I'll come back and see each one of you," she said with a smile. "When you least expect it, when you need a spot of Ms Wiz magic in your life, I'll be there." "Every one of us?" asked Simon. "Every one of you," said Ms Wiz, "and I'll bring Hecate the cat and Herbert." Ms Wiz gathered up her bag. She swung her leg over her vacuum cleaner like a cowboy about to ride out of town on his horse. "Go back to the school hall and finish prize giving," she said. "You'll find everything's back to normal." Ms Wiz hovered in mid-air by the classroom window. "See you soon, Class 3, she said, and flew off across the playground and over the school hall. "Oh, no," said Jack as the class filed back into the hall. "Look who Ms Wiz has forgotten." On the platform, beside Mr Gilbert, the school inspector and the lady mayoress, who were looking as if nothing strange had happened at all, stood 2 grey geese. "She'll have to come back now," said Katrina. "No unpleasant spells," said Podge. They heard a familiar hum from outside the hall. "Gobble, gobble, gobble." "Absolute disgrace," said Miss Gomez. Jack sighed. "I think I preferred them as geese," he said. In Stitches with Ms Wiz. Chapter 1. A Pain on Thursday. Have you ever seen an ambulance racing at top speed through the streets, overtaking cars, driving through red traffic lights, its siren blaring and its blue light flashing? Have you ever thought that it would be exciting to be riding in the back, behind the darkened windows of the ambulance? Well, it isn't. Jack Beddoes loved going fast. He had always thought that he would like to be a fireman or policeman one day, so that he could break the speed limit whenever he felt like it. But right now, as he lay in the back of an ambulance travelling at 60 miles an hour down a busy street, he wasn't interested. In fact, he would have given anything to be back at home, lying in his bed without this terrible pain in his stomach. It was the worst stomachache of all time. What was more, it had been getting more painful all day. It was so bad that he hadn't been able to concentrate at school. In the middle of the maths lesson, he had even started crying. "Please, sir," Jack's friend Caroline had put up her hand. "Jack's feeling ill." The new teacher, Mr Bailey, had continued writing on the blackboard. "I'm not surprised," he had said. "I felt ill when I looked at his work this morning." "But, sir," Caroline had protested. "Nice try, Jack," said Mr Bailey. "Just in time for the maths test on Monday. Very convenient, I must say." The ambulance took a corner with a screech of tyres. Jack groaned. If only Ms Wiz had still been at school, he thought. She had been the class teacher last term, and whenever there were problems, she somehow made it better with her magic spells. There was certainly nothing magic about Mr Bailey. When Jack hobbled home after school, he had found his father messing around with the car as usual. "Dad," Jack had said to the pair of legs sticking out from under the car, "I've got a pain in my stomach." His father continued working. "Have you been?" he asked eventually. That was the sum total of his father's medical knowledge. Even when his little sister Jenny had complained of having toothache, it had been the same old question, "Have you been?" By the time his mother had come back from the library where she worked, Jack had been sick twice. "Down in the dumps?" she had asked cheerfully. "Bit under the weather?" "No, ill." "Why not go and skateboard outside?" "I'm too ill to skateboard." "Ring the doctor, Dad," said Mrs Beddoes. "I think it's serious." It certainly felt serious, Jack thought, as the ambulance finally came to a halt. The doors swung open. Jack was put on a trolley and wheeled into the hospital. The nurse in the main hall looked down at Jack. "How are we?" she asked. Jack smiled weakly. "We're not very well," he said. "Children's ward," said the nurse to the man pushing Jack's trolley. "The doctor will be right along. I'll get them to prepare the theatre." "Theatre?" thought Jack as he was wheeled into a brightly coloured ward. "Here I am dying, and they're talking about the theatre. Weird." The other children in the ward stared as a nurse drew the curtains round Jack's bed. Just slip out of your clothes, she said, and pop into this. She gave Jack what looked like a nightie. I'm a boy, he protested feebly. And this is a gown, said the nurse. Hurry up, the consultant will be here in a minute. Jack had just put on his gown when a tall man with a white coat poked his head around the curtains. The consultant stood by Jack's bed and looked down at him like a vulture considering its breakfast. Behind him stood another doctor. She had her dark hair in a bun and wore rather peculiar glasses. Something about the way she smiled at him reminded Jack of someone he knew. Let's have a quick look at you, said the consultant, pressing the right side of Jack's stomach with his cold hands. Ow, said Jack. Uncomfortable? Yes, said Jack. The consultant turned to the nurse. Are the parents here? He asked. They've been delayed, she said. Apparently they were trying to follow the ambulance and had a small disagreement with a double-decker bus. They're all right. They rang to give their permission to operate. Jack groaned. His first time in hospital, and his father had driven into a bus while chasing the ambulance. Typical. We're going to give you a little operation, the consultant said to Jack as if it was some kind of treat. We need to take out your appendix to make you feel better. What's an appendix? It's a small, completely useless piece of gristle in your intestine, said the consultant. I promise you won't miss it. Now, we'd better hurry because that naughty appendix really ought to come out soon. That's just great, thought Jack, as he was wheeled off once again. I'm about to be cut open by someone who talks about a naughty appendix. There was something else bothering him. It was the other doctor. Now, where had he seen her before? He wished she were doing the operation. A lot of people smiled at the hospital, but she was different. She looked as if she meant it. Mr. Jones here is what we call the anaesthetist, said the consultant when Jack arrived in another room. He's going to give you a little prick in the arm and you'll fall asleep. Was Jack dreaming already? The woman doctor had seemed to give him an enormous wink, as if they were old friends. As the anaesthetist bent over his arm, there was a familiar humming noise. The needle of the injection suddenly bent over like a wilting flower. It couldn't be. Could it? Jack looked at her more closely. The hair was different, and she never used to have glasses, but there was something about the black nail varnish she was wearing. Now, where had he seen black nail varnish? Funny, said the anaesthetist, reaching for another needle. A lot of funny things are happening in the hospital at the moment, said the consultant. Aren't they, Dr. Wisdom? Dr. Wisdom! It must be! She'd promised she'd see him again. What were her exact words? I go wherever magic is needed. He certainly needed magic now. Jack felt the injection go into his arm. He heard a voice saying, Now just count to 3. Hi, Ms. W... And Jack was fast asleep. Chapter 2. Magic on Friday. Hospitalized! The word spread like wildfire through St. Barnabas School the day after Jack was taken into hospital. The Morris twins, who knew the family that lived next door to him, said he would be away from school for days. By break time, the rumour was that he would miss the rest of term. By lunch, it was generally agreed that Jack was unlikely ever to be seen at school again. What's hospitalized, sir? Caroline asked Mr. Bailey during Class 3's first lesson. It means that someone has to go into hospital, said the teacher, with a sympathetic smile. Why, Caroline? Is it someone in your family? It's Jack, sir. You remember that pain he had, sir, in maths? Jack? Mr. Bailey looked worried. I can't remember any pain. Sir! There were protests of disbelief from around the classroom. Yes, all right, I remember now. Well, it got worse and worse, said Caroline, who was beginning to enjoy herself now. By the end of the day, he was screaming in agony. Don't be ridiculous, Caroline, said Mr. Bailey nervously. Really? Hospitalized, said Caroline dramatically. She stared at Jack's empty seat. Apparently the doctors only had one question. Why wasn't this child brought in to us sooner? There's going to be an investigation. Mr. Bailey had turned very pale. "Just got to visit the headmaster," he said, scurrying to the door with an anxious, hunted look. "Revise for your math test, everyone. I'll be back in a minute." The first time Jack woke up after his operation, he felt dizzy and sick. There was a tube sticking up into his arm, he had a pain in his side, and his parents were talking at him. Thinking that he almost preferred the stomachache, he drifted off to sleep. The second time Jack woke up after his operation, it was evening, and his parents had gone home, but Ms Wiz was standing beside his bed. "Ms Wiz," Jack said weakly. "Dr. Wisdom at your service? I thought you might be needing some special magic. Can you make me feel better?" "I can't do that," said Ms Wiz, drawing the curtains around Jack's bed, "but I might be able to cheer you up a bit." She reached into an inside pocket of her white coat and pulled out a china cat. "Here's Hecate to look after you," she said, putting the cat on the bedside table. "Any time you need me, just tap him on the head." "Thanks," croaked Jack. "And you'll be needing some company," said Ms Wiz, putting her hand into another pocket and pulling out her tame magic rat. "So Herbert will be staying with you until you're better." She put Herbert the rat onto the bed. He sniffed around a bit and was about to scurry under the bedclothes when Ms Wiz said, "Not there, Herbert, it's unhygienic. Under the pillow." "But," Jack tried to concentrate, "how did you get here?" "They were expecting a supply doctor, whom I happened to know was ill, so I just turned up. They're so desperate for doctors here that they never even asked to see my papers." "Cool," said Jack. "Now remember," said Miss Wiz, tucking up the bed, "don't tell any of the nurses or doctors about our secret. They may not like the idea of magic spells in a modern hospital. They might even think I'm a sort of witch." "Can I tell the other children?" Ms Wiz looked around the ward and smiled. "Of course you can," she said. "She's never a witch!" The boy in the next bed to Jack was called Franklin. He had a bad back and he didn't believe in magic. "Witches are for wimps," he said. There was a hiss from Hecate, the china cat, and her eyes lit up. "Nice toy," said Franklin, unimpressed. He picked up his football magazine and started leafing through it. Jack was too tired to argue. "Just you wait and see," he said. The next morning, the children's ward was visited by the consultant. There was a group of medical students with him. "I took this young man's appendix out yesterday," said the consultant when he reached Jack's bed. He turned to Ms Wiz, who was standing at the back of the group. "How is he, Dr. Wisdom?" "He's recovering well," said Ms Wiz, with a little smile in Jack's direction. The consultant turned to the students and took a small bottle from his pocket. "And here," he said, "is the appendix in question. As you can see, it was badly inflamed." The students looked at the bottle, which seemed to contain a small red caterpillar floating in liquid. The consultant put the bottle down on the table beside Jack's bed. "Let's have a look at the patient," he said. "Miss Harris, would you like to check his heart?" One of the students stepped forward, put a stethoscope to her ears, and placed the other end on Jack's heart. There was a faint humming noise from the direction of Ms Wiz. The student looked puzzled. "Well," said the consultant, "what do you hear?" "It seems to be disco music," said the student. Jack winked at Franklin, who was now unable to hide his curiosity. "Give me that stethoscope," said the consultant. He listened to Jack's heart. "Extraordinary," he said. "Excuse me," said Franklin from the next bed. "There's a—" But the consultant was too busy looking at the stethoscope in his hand to pay any attention. Jack now saw what Franklin was staring at. Herbert the rat had escaped from under his pillow and, using the bedspread as cover, had made his way down to the foot of the bed. As the consultant and his students examined the stethoscope, he peeped out, ran to where the little bottle containing Jack's appendix stood, picked it up in his mouth and scurried back under the bedclothes. "Excuse me," said Franklin again. Jack put a finger to his lips and shook his head slowly. "Yes, Franklin?" asked Ms Wiz innocently. "Is something the matter?" Maybe not," said Franklin. Chapter 3. A Visit on Saturday. It was Saturday morning, Jack's third day without an appendix, and Caroline and Podge had been allowed by their parents to walk to the hospital to visit him. "How you feeling, Jacko?" asked Podge. "Not bad," said Jack, "considering I've had a major operation." "Major operation," sniffed Franklin from the next bed. "All they did was take out a small, completely useless piece of gristle." "Oh, no!" Caroline looked shocked. "You mean it was a brain operation?" Jack started to laugh, then clutched his stomach. "Don't," he said. "It hurts when I laugh." "I've got to admit that he's an interesting neighbour," Franklin went on. "He thinks his doctor is a witch." Podge looked amazed. "It's not." "It is," smiled Jack. "And he's got a rat under his pillow," Franklin continued loudly. "Shh," said Jack. "Don't let anyone know or there'll be trouble." "Ah," said Franklin. "Problem. I think I just did, about 5 minutes ago." At that moment there was a scream from the other end of the ward. News travels fast in a hospital. Franklin had told his other neighbour, Katie, who was suffering from asthma. Katie had told Matthew, who was hanging upside down with 2 broken legs. Matthew had told Michelle, who was having tests. Michelle had told Amber, who had just had her tonsils out. Amber had whispered it to Tom, who had grommets. Tom had told his mother, and that was the scream from the other end of the ward. "Now, children," said the ward sister, as Tom's mother recovered on a spare bed, "you may have heard that a small, furry animal has been seen in here." "She means a rat," said Franklin. There was a moan from Tom's mother. "And small, furry animals are not welcome in hospitals, even if they are pets, so the nurses are going to search the ward." "What will you do if you find it?" asked Jack. "Confiscate it, of course," said the ward sister. "We're lucky enough to have an experimental laboratory downstairs. They always need fresh mice and rats." Caroline and Podge gasped. Jack calmly leant over and tapped Hecate, the cat's head. Her eyes flashed. "Morning, sister," said Ms Wiz, who breezed into the ward within seconds. "Morning, Dr. Wisdom." Ms Wiz glanced at the nurses as they looked under the beds and in cupboards. "Goodness," she said, "what's going on here?" The ward sister whispered something in her ear. "A rat?" Ms Wiz seemed shocked. "In that case, I'll just check the Beddoes boys' dressing and leave you to it." Ms Wiz hurried over to Jack's bed and pulled the curtains around it. "Up to your old tricks, eh, Ms Wiz?" said Caroline quietly. "Just trying to cheer Jack up," said Ms Wiz, feeling under his pillow, eventually pulling out Herbert. "Have you got one of those cardboard bottle things?" she asked Jack. "You don't mean—" "That's right, the little bottles they give you to pee in when you're in bed." Jack passed it to Ms Wiz, who had just slipped Herbert into the bottle when the curtains drew back. It was the ward sister. "Jack's been a good boy, has he?" she said, looking at the bottle in Ms Wiz's hands. Yes." "Allow me, Doctor," said the ward sister, taking the bottle. "I'll just get rid of this for you." She was halfway across the ward when Herbert decided to put his head out for a quick look round. The ward sister shrieked and dropped the bottle. "What on earth is going on?" The consultant, who had heard the noise while passing, stood at the door. With a shaky hand, the ward sister pointed to Herbert, who was coolly looking up at them. "Stand back, everyone," shouted the consultant, grabbing a long brush that was leaning against the wall. "Look away if you don't like the sight of squashed rodent." He raised the brush over his head. There was a humming noise from the direction of Ms Wiz. Suddenly, the brush seemed to develop a life of its own. It leapt out of the consultant's hands and pushed him towards an empty corner bed. As he fell backwards on the bed, the curtains drew around the bed. There were sounds of scuffling. Not looking particularly alarmed, Herbert sidled down one side of the room and out of the door. Ms Wiz held up her hands. "Keep calm," she said. "The rat has left the room. I'm sure he'll turn up." For a moment she looked worried. Somewhere." "Did you see that brush, Doctor?" gasped the ward sister. "I'm sure there's a perfectly logical explanation for that," said Ms Wiz, walking towards the door. There were muffled sounds of protest from the corner bed. "What about the consultant?" asked the ward sister. Ms Wiz drew back the curtains. The consultant was swathed head to foot in bandages. He looked like an Egyptian mummy. "Let me out," he gasped. "Someone's going to pay for this." "Wow," said Franklin, as the consultant was wheeled out of the ward to have his bandages removed. "Your Ms Wiz is the strangest doctor I've ever seen." "If it wasn't for you, Herbert wouldn't be wandering around the hospital," said Caroline. "He'll be all right," said Jack. "After all, he's a magic rat." Franklin pulled the bedclothes up to his chin. "I'm not letting that Ms Wiz anywhere near me," he said. "She may be a good witch, but I don't trust her as a doctor." Caroline looked at her watch. "We better go, Podge," she said. "Remember, we've got to revise for the maths test." "Wait a minute," he said. "I want to ask Jack a few more questions." Jack sighed. "This pain you had," said Podge, "which side was it on?" Podge appeared to be deep in thought. He had just had a rather brilliant idea. Chapter 4. Lunch on Sunday. Mr. Bailey was a worried man. It was only his second year as a teacher, and he was finding it very difficult. The children didn't seem to respect him somehow. Whatever he asked them to do, they did the opposite. They laughed at him behind his back, and they were always playing tricks on him. That was what happened with Jack Beddoes. He had been certain that Jack's stomachache was just another trick. There was a big maths test on Monday, and Jack hated maths. But it wasn't. The stomachache was real. Jack was in hospital, and Mr. Bailey was in trouble. The headmaster at St. Barnabas had not been pleased when he heard what had happened. "I take a dim view, Mr. Bailey," he had said. "After all, children are people, you know." "Are they?" Mr. Bailey had said. He wasn't sure any more. "Why not," the headmaster had sounded tired, "try to be nice for a change?" "Yes, headmaster." Which was why this Sunday morning Mr. Bailey was going to visit the hospital. He had bought some flowers and a bunch of grapes and a get-well card. Maybe if he was nice to Jack, Class 3 would be nice to him. It was worth a try. Ms. Wiz was worried too. Ever since the consultant had been pushed around by a brush and wrapped up like a Christmas present, he had been giving her very suspicious looks. "It's strange," he said as they did their morning rounds of the wards. "You turn up at the hospital as if by magic, and since then nothing's been quite normal. Bending needles, musical stethoscopes, flying brushes, rats. Where is that animal, by the way?" Ms. Wiz shook her head. She hadn't the faintest idea where Herbert was. Secretly, she was afraid that he might decide to investigate the experimental laboratory. He could be quite a mischievous little rat sometimes. "Yes, it is rather strange," she said. "What's more, you're never around when real medical work is needed." Ms. Wiz laughed. "Perhaps that's a good thing," she said. "Morning, nurse," said Jack's father to the ward sister as he arrived for his morning visit. "Has he been yet?" "Dad," protested Jack. "Not yet," smiled the ward sister. "It takes a while after an appendix operation. Once he moves his bowels, we'll know he's really on the mend." "What are bowels?" asked Jack's little sister Jenny. "Things inside you that move from time to time," said Mrs. Beddoes. "Not very often in Jack's case," boomed his father. Jack noticed a familiar figure standing at the ward door, looking confused. At last Mr. Bailey spotted him. "Hello, young lad," he said. "I've brought you some goodies." "Thank you," said Jack. "These are my parents and my sister. This is Mr. Bailey." The smile left the teacher's face. It wasn't my fault," he stammered. "They're always saying they've got stomach aches or earaches or they feel sick, particularly when there's a maths test coming up. You don't know who to believe, do you? They're such liars, children. I mean, not Jack, but the others. I didn't know it was an appendix. I'm not a doctor, am I? You can't blame me for that, can you?" "Don't worry, Mr. Bailey," said Jack's mother. "We all make mistakes." There was an embarrassed silence. "So," Jack said eventually, "who'd like to see my appendix?" It was a tiring morning for Jack. Mr. Bailey always had that effect on him, and watching him trying to impress his parents somehow made it even worse. So when a nurse brought him lunch on a tray, he didn't feel the slightest bit hungry. "Come on, Jack," said his mother. "You'll never get well if you don't eat." "I just don't feel up to plastic chicken and stringy red cabbage," said Jack. "Yum," said Mr. Bailey loudly. "It looks delicious to me." Quite why Ms Wiz walked into the ward at this particular moment, Jack never discovered. She was pretending to look at Tom, the boy with grommets, but Jack could tell that she was up to something from the quiet humming noise that was coming from her direction. The bottle containing his appendix was on the table behind where Mr. Bailey and his parents were sitting. This meant that only Jack and Franklin saw the bottle open quietly. As if it were a real live caterpillar, the appendix wriggled out. "Just eat a bit," Jack's father was saying. "A mouthful for each of us." The appendix crawled along the edge of the table. "It's getting cold," said his sister. Jack was speechless. The appendix was making its way onto the lunch tray and into the red cabbage. "I know what we'll do," said Mr. Bailey. "I'll eat a mouthful, then you eat a mouthful." "I don't think—" "Here's a spare spoon," interrupted Franklin with an innocent little smile. Mr. Bailey," said Jack. But it was too late. The teacher dipped his spoon into the red cabbage. Jack closed his eyes. When he opened them, Mr. Bailey was chewing with a slightly pained smile. The appendix had gone. "Delicious," said Mr. Bailey, swallowing with some difficulty. Jack glanced over to where Ms. Wiz was standing. He really thought she had gone too far this time. She shrugged helplessly. "That's odd," said Franklin, pointing at the empty appendix bottle. "Your spare part's gone missing." "So it has," said Jack. "Funny how similar to red cabbage it looks," said Franklin. Mr. Bailey looked at the empty bottle and then at the half-eaten plate of cabbage. Suddenly, he felt a little queasy. "Better be going now," he said, getting unsteadily to his feet. "Bye, sir," said Jack. "Thanks for coming." Mr. Bailey walked quickly out of the hospital towards his car. It couldn't have been, could it? That red cabbage had tasted a little rubbery. Perhaps the story would get out. Jack would be bound to spread it around. It would probably get into the local paper. He could see the headlines now. "Cruel teacher eats boy's appendix." "Why me?" he shouted to an empty car park. He kicked his car, hurting his foot. "Why is it always me?" Chapter 5. Mayhem on Monday. Ms. Wiz had looked everywhere for Herbert. She had visited all the wards in the hospital. She had checked in the reception hall. She had even searched the kitchen. The only place where she had yet to look was the experimental laboratory, which had been locked up over the weekend. Now it was Monday morning, and Ms. Wiz was on her way to the laboratory. It was her last chance. After all, life wouldn't be the same without Herbert. "Dr. Wisdom!" Ms. Wiz heard a familiar voice behind her as she hurried down a corridor. She turned to see the consultant. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I was just looking in on the laboratory," said Ms. Wiz. I'm rather interested in an experiment they're doing." "You're looking for that rat, aren't you?" "Rat? You know what I think?" The consultant put his face close to hers. "I don't think you're a doctor at all. I've seen the way you go pale at the sight of blood. You're never around when I need help with an operation. I think you're an intruder." Ms. Wiz smiled. She was wondering whether she should turn him into a rabbit. Perhaps not, she decided. A rabbit hopping about the hospital with a stethoscope around its neck would make people even more suspicious. "I'm going to check your papers," said the consultant. "If it turns out you're not a real doctor, I'm calling the police. Impersonating a doctor, that's serious." He smiled coldly. "They'll probably send you to prison." Jack was sitting on the edge of his bed. Although his stomach was still sore and he was a bit weak, he was feeling much better. His parents were going to take him home that morning. "So, it's goodbye again," said Ms. Wiz, who was doing her normal round of the children's ward. "Your stitches will come out in a few days' time, and you'll be as good as new." "Thank you for looking after me," said Jack. "Having an appendix out isn't so bad after all." "I think you should go and see Mr. Bailey as soon as you can," said Ms. Wiz. "After all, he visited you." "Do us some more tricks, Doc," said Franklin. "I'm going out tomorrow and I'll have something to tell them." "No more tricks, I'm afraid, Franklin. I'm leaving today." "What about Herbert?" asked Jack. "He'll just have to look after himself," said Ms. Wiz. "I can't find him anywhere." Just then the doors of the ward opened and the consultant strode in, his white coat flapping. There were 2 policemen with him. "That's her," he said, pointing at Ms. Wiz. "She's the imposter." "But that's Dr. Wisdom," said the ward sister. "Doctor? Ha!" The consultant's voice echoed round the children's ward as the 2 policemen advanced towards Ms. Wiz. One of them, who had now produced a notebook, asked, "Are you Dr. or Miss Dolores Wiz?" At that moment, the swing doors behind the consultant crashed open and a white tidal wave of live, squeaking creatures poured into the ward. "What on earth?" gasped the consultant. Mice, hundreds of them swarming around the floor, climbing the curtains, exploring every corner, and in the thick of them, standing up on his hind legs and looking about him like a general surveying the field of battle, was Herbert. "There you are, Herbert," said Ms. Wiz, reaching down for him. "So you were in the laboratory after all, were you? Freeing all the mice?" Jack picked his way through the swarm of white mice and whispered something in the consultant's ear. "Dr. Wisdom," shouted the consultant over the din. "Rid the hospital of these creatures and you can go free. I'll drop all charges against you." Ms. Wiz raised her hand and whistled. The mice froze, staring at her with little pink eyes. She picked up Herbert and looked around the ward for the last time. "Thanks, Jack," she said cheerfully. "See you again soon." "And me, Ms. Wiz," said Franklin. "Of course, whenever a bit of magic's needed. Bye, everyone." She waved to the other children before making her way out of the ward, followed by Herbert's mouse army. "And so Ms. Wiz saved the hospital from a plague of white mice," Jack told Class 3 that afternoon when he visited them. Even Mr. Bailey, who had allowed Jack to speak about hospital during a lesson, looked impressed. "What will she do with the mice?" asked Caroline. "Probably lead them to the countryside and set them free," said Jack. Alex put his hand up. "Can we see your appendix?" he asked. "Caroline said you'd kept it in a bottle." Right, back to work, class," Mr. Bailey interrupted nervously. "Oh, I threw it away," said Jack. "Who wants an old piece of gristle anyway?" He glanced at Mr. Bailey, who smiled with relief. Perhaps the headmaster had been right. Children were humans, after all. "By the way," asked Jack, "where's Podge?" An ambulance raced through the streets of the town, its siren blaring and its blue light flashing. In the back lay the patient, moaning quietly and clutching his right side. It worked, thought Podge, as the ambulance screeched around a corner. He had remembered everything Jack had told him about his appendix. Mr. Bailey had called the doctor, and here he was on the way to hospital. All he would have now was a small operation, 5 days in hospital with Ms. Wiz looking after him, a few stitches, and that would be that. It was a small price to pay for missing the maths test. The ambulance stopped. The doors were opened, and Podge was wheeled on a stretcher towards the hospital. "Hello, Podge." It was Ms. Wiz, with Herbert under her arm. "What's up?" "Appendix, Ms. Wiz," groaned Podge. Hecat's eyes lit up. "Oh dear, what a pity, I'm just going," said Ms. Wiz. "In fact, I only came back to collect Herbert." "Going? So you'll just have to face your major operation all on your own." Podge gulped. Maybe—" Ms. Wiz laughed. "Lend us your stretcher, Podge," she said. Podge thought for a moment and then rolled off the stretcher. "Oh, well," he said, "it was worth a try." "Thanks, Podge," said Ms. Wiz, climbing on. The stretcher rose and hovered over the heads of the ambulance men. "I'll be back when you're least expecting me," she called out as the stretcher rose higher, turned slowly and floated over the roof of the hospital and out of sight. As Podge and the ambulance men watched Ms Wiz disappear, a nurse walked out of the hospital. She had a clipboard under her arm. "Well, young man," she said, "let's get you registered. How's the pain now?" "Better, thank you," said Podge. "Suddenly much better." "You're nicked, Ms Wiz." Chapter 1. A sort of missing person. "Daydreaming again, Lizzie Thompson?" The words came to Lizzie from far away. She had been staring out of the window into the playground at St Barnabas School, unaware that her class teacher, Mr Bailey, was standing in front of her desk. "Sorry, sir," she said quietly. "I was thinking about my cat." "Your what?" "My cat, Waif." "Oh, I see," said Mr Bailey. "Here we all are in the middle of an English lesson, discussing similes, and Liz is off in a private fantasy about her cat. That's absolutely fine, then, isn't it?" "It's lost, sir," said Jack, who was one of Liz's best friends. "It disappeared yesterday." "Well, staring out of the window's not going to help, is it?" said the teacher briskly. "Cruel," muttered Podge at the back of the classroom. "How would he like it?" Mr Bailey thumped Liz's desk. "I would like it if Class 3 did some work for a change," he said loudly. "Now back to similes. Here is an example of a simile. Podge sits at his desk like a sack of potatoes. Now who can give me another simile?" Caroline put up her hand. "Our teacher is like someone who doesn't know how you feel when you lose a pet, and then he can't even manage to be nice when a person's so upset that she can't concentrate on a boring English lesson, especially when it's taught by a cat-hater. Or is that a metaphor, sir?" Everybody in Class 3 laughed, except for Lizzie, who was looking out of the window again. After school, Lizzie ran home, hoping for the best but fearing the worst. All day she had been unable to think of anything but Waif. Now, as she ran, she remembered the winter's day when she had found him, cold, shivering and hungry among the dustbins by her house. He had hardly been more than a kitten. When no one came to feed him after a few days, she took him in. Waif, she had called him. And now he was gone. "I've looked everywhere," said Lizzie's mother when she arrived home. "In cupboards, down the street, in the park." She hesitated. "Under cars?" Tears welled up in Liz's eyes. "You think he's dead, don't you?" she said. Mrs. Thompson put her arm around her daughter. "It's dangerous for cats around here. People drive so fast," she said, adding gently, "He's had a good innings." "He's only 6, Mummy," sobbed Lizzie. "Since when has 6 been a good innings?" She ran upstairs to her room and slammed the door. The next morning, Lizzie did something she had never done before. After waving goodbye to her mother at the end of her street, she walked towards St Barnabas as usual, but instead of turning right towards the high street where she normally met Jack and Caroline, she turned left into the park. "I just know that Waif is alive," she muttered to herself, "and today I'm going to find him." "Good for you, dear," said an old tramp woman who was sitting on a park bench nearby. But Lizzie was too deep in thought to pay her any attention. Lizzie's plan to find Waif went like this. 1. Look under a lot of bushes. 2. Pin up on trees the notices she had written late last night. They read, "Lost. Beautiful white cat with ginger patches. Male. Answers to name of Waif or Waify. Much loved. If found, please phone 579-8282. 3. Go to the police station and ask for their help." But nothing went right. All morning Lizzie looked under bushes without success. She pinned up her notices, but then there were so many other lost cat notices that she began to despair. "Everyone round here seems to have lost a cat recently," she sighed. Finally, late that afternoon, she stumbled into the local police station. "And what can I do for you, young lady?" asked the police constable behind the desk. "I've lost my cat," said Lizzie nervously. The policeman chuckled, as if he'd just been told a rather good joke. "Do you know what this is, young lady?" he said, tapping a big book in front of him.
It's called The Crime Book. In this book, I note down all the really terrible things that people get up to in this area. Theft, hit and run, breaking and entering, bag snatching, vagrancy, motor offences, missing persons, grievous bodily harm, all sorts of nastiness." "I see," said Lizzie. "And now you want me to add to the list of ongoing, unsolved misdemeanours one little moggy that's gone walkabout, right?" "He's a sort of missing person, too." "Listen, miss, I know cats. They wander, especially Toms." "He's not a Tom," said Lizzie. "He's neuter." The policeman looked confused. "New to what?" he asked. "If he's new to the area, no wonder he's lost." P.C. Boot, another policeman who had overheard the conversation, now joined them. He winked at Lizzie. "When the young lady says her cat's neuter, I think she means that he's—" He whispered into the police constable's ear. "Oh dear," said P.C. Boot, wincing slightly. He turned to Lizzie. "When did this, neutering happen, then?" "Don't worry, miss," said the second policeman quickly. "We'll let you know if we hear of a lost cat. Just give P.C. Boot here the details." Sighing heavily, P.C. Boot noted in the crime book Lizzie's name, telephone number, and her description of waif. "Looking for lost cats," he muttered. "I've heard it all now." Lizzie turned to leave. Somehow finding waif was turning out to be even more difficult than she thought it was going to be. Miserably, she stood on the steps of the police station, wondering what to do next. "What you need is a spot of magic," said a familiar voice. It was the tramp who had seen Lizzie in the park. She was pushing a pram full of old rags on which sat a china cat with odd, glowing eyes. "Thanks," sniffed Lizzie. "And where exactly do you find magic these days?" "Follow me," said the tramp. Chapter 2. A Strange Coincidence. Mr. Bailey was panicking. Yesterday, Lizzie Thompson had been upset about her cat. And what had he done? He had shouted, told her to get on with her work and hit the desk with his hand. And now Lizzie was absent from class. He had gone too far yet again. He would just have to ask the headmaster to ring her mother. Mrs. Thompson was panicking. When the headmaster had rung to find out whether Lizzie was ill, she had been at work. It was 3 in the afternoon before she found out that her daughter had been missing all day. Then she rang the police. P.C. Boot was panicking. As soon as the report of a missing girl came through, he realized that this was the very same girl he had seen that afternoon. "And what happened to her, police constable?" asked the station sergeant. "She walked out of the station, Sarge," mumbled P.C. Boot. "And? I think I might have seen her walking off with a tramp." The police sergeant sighed and reached for a telephone. This could be serious. Very serious indeed. "But I don't understand why you're all dressed in rags, Ms. Wiz." Lizzie and the tramp woman were sitting in a dingy cafe drinking tea. Outside it was already getting dark. An old man at the next table was darting suspicious looks in their direction as he shook a tomato ketchup bottle over his egg and chips. "The last time I saw you," Lizzie continued, "you were a teacher." Ms. Wiz smiled. "Do you remember what I told you then?" she asked. "I said I'd be back whenever a spot of magic was needed. So here I am." "I see," said Lizzie quietly. She was beginning to wonder whether she was right to be here, sitting in a cafe with Ms. Wiz. A worrying thought had occurred to her. Maybe it was somebody pretending to be Ms. Wiz. What if this was the dangerous stranger she had always been told never to talk to? "Watch," said the tramp woman, as if she could read Lizzie's mind. There was a low hum from where she was sitting. "Blimey!" said the man sitting at the next-door table, as the contents of the tomato ketchup bottle covered his plate. "That's not magic," said Lizzie. "That's life." There was a slurping noise as the ketchup disappeared back into the bottle. "Blimey!" gasped the man. "Ms. Wiz," said Lizzie, laughing for the first time that day, "you never change, do you?" "Only in the way I look," said Ms. Wiz, taking a notebook from her pocket. "Now, let's get down to business." "Do you want a pen?" asked Lizzie. That won't be necessary, said Ms Wiz. Cat's name? Waif. Missing for how long? 2 days. Distinguishing features? Green eyes, lovely white coat with ginger patches. Lizzie sighed as she remembered Waif. Very friendly. Other facts known? Only that everyone round here seems to have lost a cat. Ms Wiz looked thoughtful. Seems a strange coincidence. Yes, said Lizzie, it is strange, and all the lost cat notices mentioned that they had nice coats. That seemed a bit odd. Odd, said Ms Wiz, and worrying. It's time for us to get moving. Aren't you going to note anything down? Asked Lizzie. Whoops, silly me, said Ms Wiz, staring hard at the notebook. As if an invisible hand were writing, the page quickly filled up with notes. There you go, she said briskly. Lizzie shook her head. Nothing was ever straightforward when Ms Wiz was around. Now what do we do? She asked. I'm going to tell you our plan, said Ms Wiz, but before that we're going to write to your mother, who will be worrying about you. Then we're going home. To your home? Lizzie couldn't believe her ears. When she was a teacher, Ms Wiz had always been very mysterious about where she lived, and no one from Class 3 had been invited back. That's not much, shrugged Ms Wiz, but I think you'll like it. It was dark by the time a letter from Lizzie was slipped under Mrs Thompson's door. It read, Dear Mum, please don't worry about me. I'm all right and I've met up with someone who's going to use magic to help me find Waif. Do you remember Ms Wiz, our magical teacher? People called her a witch, but she always said that she was a paranormal operative. Well, it's her, except now she's a tramp. I'm staying at Ms Wiz's home, so everything is all right. Love, Lizzie. Kiss, kiss, kiss. P.S. Don't get the police to look for us. They probably wouldn't recognise me since Ms Wiz's plan is to turn me into a cat. Mrs Thompson read the note again. Slowly the awful truth began to sink in. Her only daughter had run off with a tramp, or maybe a witch, and she was about to be turned into a cat. With a little cry, Mrs Thompson ran to telephone the police. Chapter 3. Magic or Trouble. Is this it? Lizzie was unable to keep the disappointment from her voice when they reached Ms Wiz's home, because it wasn't really a home at all. It was an extremely old car with flat tyres and dents all over it. It did have curtains, but even they were more like rags, hung over the windows to stop people peering in. Yes, this is it, said Ms Wiz proudly. What do you think? Interesting, said Lizzie, who didn't want to hurt Ms Wiz's feelings. Not quite what I expected, but interesting. If you like it now, just wait until you step inside. Ms Wiz opened the door with a flourish. Lizzie gasped. From the outside, Ms Wiz's car had looked no more than a tangle of rusty, useless metal, just the sort of place where you might expect a tramp to live. But inside, it was even worse. All that Lizzie could see were torn grey rugs, old newspapers and half-eaten sandwiches. Then something moved on the back seat, something small and grey. A rat! Lizzie screamed. Of course, said Ms Wiz. Don't you remember Herbert, my magic rat? She picked up Herbert and clambered into the car. You can use the guest bedroom, she said, pointing to the back seat. Reluctantly, Lizzie climbed in. Close the door behind you, said Ms Wiz. Something very strange happened as Lizzie pulled the door shut. There was a low hum, and as if someone had thrown a switch somewhere, the car started changing. The front seats turned around and became small armchairs. A table with crisps and lemonade appeared out of the floor. The back seat became a sofa, and the gear stick was transformed into a lamp which lit up the inside of the car with a soft pink glow. Lizzie couldn't believe her eyes. It was as if she was no longer in a rusty old wreck of a car, but in a warm country cottage. Being a paranormal operative has its advantages, smiled Ms Wiz. What are we going to do now? Asked Lizzie, settling down on the sofa. She was beginning to feel sleepy. We'll wait up for the catnappers, said Ms Wiz. Catnappers? That's where your waif has gone, said Ms Wiz. And those other cats, they've been kidnapped. I'm sure of it. But why? Gloves, said Ms Wiz grimly. Fur gloves. That's why all the cats that have disappeared have nice coats. Suddenly Lizzie felt afraid. Looking under bushes was one thing, but staying up all night to catch a gang of catnappers... For a moment she wished she was back in her bed, safe. "Help yourself to crisps," said Ms Wiz, peering through the curtains into the darkness of the park outside. "I'll keep lookout. All the local cats come to this park at night, and I have a feeling that our friends, the catnappers, will be here too. They'll lead us to Waif." "How do you know he's alive?" Lizzie asked. "Let's just put it down to intuition," said Ms Wiz. Lizzie felt braver now. After all, she was with Ms Wiz. They had magic on their side. "Jack, a policeman's here to ask you some questions." Jack Beddoes had just been dozing off when his mother switched on the light. There, in his bedroom, stood a policeman with a notebook in his hand. "Sorry to interrupt your beauty sleep, young man," said P.C. Boot, "but we have a small emergency concerning your friend Lizzie." Jack rubbed his eyes. "What's happened to her?" he asked. "Her mother has received a letter which gives us reason to believe that she has been abducted by a certain..." P.C. Boot looked in his notebook. "Ms Wiz." "Ms Wiz?" Jack sat up in his bed. "Where is she?" "That's the problem," said P.C. Boot. "At first we thought she was just a tramp, but now it turns out that she's an all-round troublemaker. We think Lizzie's gone off with her." "That's all right then," said Jack. "All right?" P.C. Boot seemed surprised. "According to information received, this Ms Wiz has in the past turned teachers into geese, removed a school inspector's trousers, and released about 1,000 white mice into the children's ward of a general hospital. That's not what I call all right." "Ms Wiz is magic," said Jack. P.C. Boot put on his most serious expression. "You call it magic, son," he said. "I call it trouble. Now, we need to know exactly what she looks like." "Here we go," said Ms Wiz, peering through the curtains of her car. A van drew up by the gates of the park. 2 men in dark clothes stepped out and climbed over the railings. The younger and taller of the 2 men was carrying a net, while the other, a short elderly man with a slight limp, followed him, whistling softly. "Come on then," whispered Ms Wiz, shaking Lizzie by the shoulder. "Hmm?" said Lizzie sleepily. "Our friends are here," said Ms Wiz. "It's time to put our plan into action." After no more than half an hour the men returned. They were carrying 2 cats trapped in the net. "This tabby puss is a young un," said the older man. "Shall I let it go?" "Young or old makes no difference," said the other man, opening the back of the van and bundling the cats into a sack. "And stop calling them puss. Sometimes I think you're too soft for this game." "What do we do now?" Lizzie whispered, as moments later the van began to move. "Follow them, of course," answered Ms Wiz. "Just because my home's got 4 flat tires, it doesn't mean it can't go." And sure enough, the old car just then seemed to raise itself slightly at that moment and, as if hovering just above the ground, moved quietly forward to follow the van. "The moment we arrive, we put our plan into action," said Ms Wiz, as they drove quietly down the dark streets, always keeping a safe distance from the catnappers in front of them. "Right," said Lizzie quietly. She was thinking of her mother and how worried she would be. Still, there was no going back now. Ms Wiz glanced over her shoulder. "Nervous?" she asked. "Not really," Lizzie lied, "so long as you're there to help." Soon the van drew up outside a large dark house with closed shutters. "I know this place," whispered Lizzie. "It's called the Old Hospital." "All right," said Ms Wiz, stopping the car. "Ready?" The men were getting out and opening the back of the van. "Ready," said Lizzie, closing her eyes. There was a low hum from the front of the car. Lizzie felt as if she had been slapped hard on the back. When she opened her eyes, everything in the car was bigger. She was looking up at Ms Wiz, who was smiling. "What a lovely cat," Ms Wiz said. "Now remember the plan. You follow them into the house, and as soon as you're alone with the cats, scratch your left ear 3 times. I'll be outside, and as soon as I get that message, I'll turn you back into Lizzie again. Then you let the cats out. All right?" "Sure," said Lizzie with a cat smile. To her surprise, she found that she could still talk in her normal voice. The men were carrying the sack up the steps to the house when Lizzie, now a sleek black cat, went after them. As they opened the door, she slipped in behind them.
Ms Wiz stood by her car, staring up at the house. "Good luck, Lizzie," she muttered. It was then that she felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. "You're nicked, Ms Wiz," said P.C. Boot. Chapter 4. Abandoned. It wasn't bad being a cat, Lizzie discovered. Nobody noticed you, for example. You could creep under tables and hide in the shadows. You could jump onto window ledges as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And even if you did lose your balance, you always seemed to land on your feet. It was quite fun. Or at least it would have been if Lizzie had been in a normal house rather than in a catnapper's den. Lizzie quickly discovered where they kept the cats. The older of the catnappers had trudged down to the cellar with the sack on his back. There was an unearthly yowling sound as a door was opened. "There you go, my lovelies," he said. "Good puss." Lizzie heard hissing and scrabbling as the two new cats were bundled into the room. She ducked under a chair as the man returned, carrying an empty sack. "That's about it, then," he said to the other catnapper. "Mrs. Darcy from the first shop will be along tomorrow morning to tell us which ones she needs. Then," for a moment he looked almost sad, "it's bye-bye pussies." "This is the last time I take you on a job," said the younger man. "Honestly, a catnapper that likes cats, I've heard it all now." The older man sniffed. "I feel sorry for them, that's all. You wouldn't understand. If you like them so much, you'd better feed them." The man fetched a paper sack of cat food and, calling out, "Din-dins, pussies," he limped down the stairs. Lizzie followed. For a moment, as he opened the door and threw some food in, there was total confusion in the room, and in that moment Lizzie slipped in. What she saw took her breath away. There were cats everywhere. Some were fighting over the food, some were meowing pitifully, some were pacing backwards and forwards, some were simply asleep. One or two of the cats, startled to hear a human voice coming from a cat, arched their backs and hissed nervously. "Don't worry," said Lizzie, carefully stepping through the throng of cats. "I'm just looking for someone. I'm not really a cat myself." At that moment, a big ginger Tom stepped forward and cuffed her around the ear. "Ow!" said Lizzie. Without thinking, she tapped him back, leaving her claws out. Surprised, the Tom retreated backwards into a tabby which bit him. "Stop fighting, you stupid animals," said Lizzie angrily. "Don't you realize that tomorrow you could be—" At that moment Lizzie saw a familiar white form in a corner. "Waif?" The white cat stirred, recognizing the voice, and gave a soft meow. Lizzie looked closer. Yes, it was Waif, asleep as usual. It was time for action. Soon the catnappers would be going to bed. All Lizzie needed to do was to give Ms Wiz the signal to turn her back into a human, sneak out of the door, and then lead the cats to freedom. Bracing herself for the shock, Lizzie scratched herself 3 times behind the left ear. Nothing happened. "Come on, Ms Wiz," she muttered, trying to keep calm. "Get that magic working." She scratched again, harder this time, but nothing happened. "Ms Wiz, where are you?" With growing desperation, Lizzie scratched and scratched and scratched, but absolutely nothing happened. "Don't you understand? Magic doesn't work at long distance. I can't change her back into a little girl from here." Ms Wiz was sitting in a small, white-walled room at the police station. For the past hour she had been trying to explain to P.C. Boot exactly why she needed to return to the catnapper's house as soon as possible. "I see," said the police constable. "So your, magic is a bit like my walkie-talkie, is it? You have to be in range for it to work." Ms Wiz sighed wearily. Why was it that grown-ups found it so difficult to understand magic when children found it so easy? "That's right," she said. "And you expect me to believe that you've cast a spell," P.C. Boot could hardly keep the disbelief out of his voice, "transforming Lizzie Thompson into a cat in order to save a load of moggies from a couple of nasty men who want to turn them into gloves. And that's why you were at the old hospital." "Precisely," said Ms Wiz. "You must think I'm daft."
Ms Wiz was about to reply when the door opened. It was the station sergeant. "Any luck, Constable?" he asked. "I'm afraid not," said P.C. Boot. "We're still in the land of witches and wizards." "Right," said the sergeant. "She can spend the night in the cells. Tomorrow morning we've got 2 of Liz's classmates coming in to tell us whether this really is the famous Ms Wiz." "You don't seem to understand," said Ms Wiz. "Tomorrow could be too late." P.C. Boot turned to the sergeant and, with a grim little smile, tapped the side of his head. At first, when they were led into the small room at the police station, Jack and Caroline didn't recognize Ms Wiz. After a worried, sleepless night in the cells, she looked more like a tired, dishevelled tramp than ever. Then she smiled. "Ms Wiz," said Caroline, hugging her. "You look so different," said Jack. "Hello, Caroline and Jack," said Ms Wiz. "Could you explain to this policeman who I am?" But as the children told P.C. Boot about Ms Wiz, he continued to look suspicious. "I'll need to discuss this with my superiors," he said eventually. "But there's no time for that," said Ms Wiz angrily. She turned to the children. "Do either of you know the way to the old hospital?" "I do," said Jack. Suddenly the sound of a low hum filled the room. P.C. Boot was just about to speak when something very odd happened. He turned into a white rabbit. "Sorry about that," said Miss Wiz, unlocking the door to the room with the keys that were now on the floor. "Let's go, children." The police station now appeared to be completely empty, except for a number of white rabbits. "Did you have to turn the whole police force into rabbits?" asked Jack as they hurried out of the main entrance. "There's going to be terrible trouble." "I couldn't mess around," said Miss Wiz briskly. "This is a matter of life and death." "Why didn't you do it earlier, then?" asked Caroline. "I didn't know the way to the old hospital," said Miss Wiz. "I may be magic, but my sense of direction is terrible." Outside the station stood a police car. Ms Wiz opened the car door and, pushing a white rabbit aside, leapt into the driver's seat. "Jump in," she shouted. The police car's engine started with a roar. "Let's just hope we're in time." Chapter 5. Fur Free. A thin ray of light penetrated the gloom of the cellar at the old hospital. Lizzie lay dozing, curled up beside Waif. Her left ear was sore from where she had been scratching all night. She was frightened. Some of the cats around her stirred restlessly as they heard the sound of footsteps approaching the cellar. The door was flung open to reveal the most extraordinary woman Lizzie had ever seen. She was very tall and was wearing fur from head to foot. "Ugh, disgusting," said the woman. "If there's one thing I hate, it's live creatures." "Think of them as pelts, Mrs. Darcy," said the younger catnapper nervously. "That's what they'll be soon." Mrs. Darcy looked around the room. "Frankly," she said, "there are some pelts here that I wouldn't allow my chauffeur to clean my car with." The older man looked shocked. "Madam uses fur on her car?" he asked. "I use fur for everything," said Mrs. Darcy with a dangerous smile. "Every item of clothing that I wear was once alive." She stroked her soft mink coat. "Now, let's get down to business. Count these horrible animals, and I'll tell you how much I can pay." The police car arrived at the old hospital with a squeal of brakes. "Look, Miss Wiz," said Jack, pointing to a large grey Rolls-Royce with a number plate which read Fur 1, which was parked outside the front door. "Just as I feared," said Miss Wiz, jumping out. "The fur merchant is here. Come on." Jack and Caroline followed her up the steps. Without hesitating, Ms Wiz kicked the front door, causing it to open with a loud crack. "Wow," said Caroline. "Magic." "No," said Ms Wiz grimly. "That wasn't magic. That was anger." Just then the older catnapper limped up the stairs from the cellar. "Here, what you lot doing?" he said. "We're here for the cats, so don't try and stop us," said Ms Wiz. The old man smiled. "Stop you rescuing my little pussies? Why would I do that?" He winked as he walked past them towards the door. "I'll leave you to it. Good luck." "Was that magic?" asked Jack. "No, I think it was something called conscience," replied Ms Wiz. At that moment the 3 of them became aware of someone else climbing the stairs towards them. "I don't know who you are," said a loud voice from the darkness in front of them, "but my name is Mrs. Darcy. I'm very rich, very powerful, and when I'm annoyed I can be very unpleasant." "Careful, Miss Wiz," whispered Jack. "She looks as if she means it." "We want those cats," Ms Wiz called out. "Open that door right now." Mrs. Darcy laughed. "I'm sure you do," she said. "From the way you're dressed, you look as if you could use a fur coat." "I'm fur-free," said Ms Wiz, moving closer. "That's quite far enough," warned Mrs. Darcy. "You're probably absolutely filthy. I don't want any nasty marks on my fur coat." "What fur coat?" asked Ms Wiz innocently, as the sound of a low hum filled the basement stairs. Automatically, Mrs. Darcy touched her coat and gasped. The fur was beginning to move, as if it had a life of its own. "What's happening?" she said, going pale. "Nothing much," said Miss Wiz. "I'll release the cats in a moment. But first of all I want to free the animals that made your coat." Before Jack's and Caroline's astonished eyes, Mrs. Darcy's clothes were becoming a writhing mass of animals. "But everything I'm wearing is fur," she shrieked. "Oh dear," said Ms Wiz, "how very embarrassing." By now Mrs. Darcy's coat had completely disappeared, and several small furry animals were shaking and scratching themselves at her feet. With a scream she ran up the stairs as the rest of her clothes began to turn back into animals. Ms Wiz opened the door to the cellar. The second of the two catnappers was standing, apparently unable to move, in the middle of the room. One of the cats had gone to sleep on his feet. "I thought of turning him into a mouse," said Miss Wiz, "but in the end I decided on a human statue. Cats can be so cruel." "There's Waif!" shouted Caroline, pointing across the room. "Never mind Waif," said Jack. "What about Lizzie?" At that moment a sleek black cat stretched sleepily and scratched herself 3 times behind the left ear. "Lizzie!" Within moments of becoming a human being again, Lizzie had telephoned her mother. Now, minutes later, mother and daughter were hugging each other joyfully on the steps of the old hospital. "Where's Waif?" asked Mrs. Thompson. "He's being fed in the kitchen with all the other cats," said Jack. "We're going to hold on to them until we can find all their owners." "And who on earth is that odd woman hiding in the Rolls-Royce without any clothes on?" Lizzie laughed. "It's a long story," she said. "Perhaps Miss Wiz had better explain it. Where is she, by the way?" "Oh, no," said Jack, who had noticed Miss Wiz's battered old car rising slowly off its flat tires, like a hovercraft about to move off. "She can't go now." A white rabbit was hopping busily down the road towards them. "Miss Wiz!" shouted Lizzie. "You've forgotten the police. They're still rabbits." The car hesitated and hovered with a low hum. "All right," said P.C. Boot, shaking himself as if he had just woken from a rather strange dream. "Where are these catnappers, then?" "The ringleader's over there," said Lizzie, pointing to Mrs. Darcy's car. "But she's—" "No buts," said the policeman. "Leave this to me." He walked slowly towards the Rolls-Royce. "Right, you in there," he said, bending down to look in the window. "You're nicked. You're knacked. Oh no, you're absolutely naked." He turned away, blushing. And everyone, even P.C. Boot, started laughing. In control, Ms. Wiz? Chapter 1. Who was that woman? Above Mr. Goff's desk at the Latimer Road Library was a sign which read, "Quiet, please." Today, as usual, it was being ignored. In the children's corner, a group of 5-year-olds were laughing at a story being read to them by their teacher. By one of the armchairs, a blue bottle was buzzing around the head of an old man who had fallen asleep. Among the bookshelves, the new assistant librarian was flicking her duster at the books like a charioteer cracking a whip. At the front desk, Mr. Goff was sniffling into his handkerchief, and in the reference section, Peter Harris, Podge, to everyone who knew him, was telling his school friend Jack Beddoes some really interesting facts he had just discovered. "Did you know that in 1955, Philip Yadzik of Chicago, USA, ate 77 large hamburgers in 2 hours?" "Gross," said Jack, who was trying to read a football book. or that the heaviest man in the world came from East Ham, England, and weighed an astonishing 59 stone? Big, said Jack. And that the world's largest jelly... Podge, said Jack, putting down his book. Did you know that the most annoying person in the entire universe is Podge Motormouth Harris of London, England, who once had a Guinness Book of Records pushed right up his left nostril because he talked about food all the time? All right, said Podge. I was just trying to improve your general knowledge. At that moment, the sniffling noise coming from Mr. Goff's desk stopped. He took a deep breath and went, "Wah, wah, wah, wah!" It was an extraordinary noise for anyone to make, and it was particularly strange coming from Mr. Goff, who was a timid, polite man. Normally the only sound he ever made was the occasional shh. Everybody stared. Mr. Goff removed his spectacles and wiped them with a handkerchief. He looked around the library, sniffed a few times, and took another deep breath. "Wah!" "Fire!" said the old man in the armchair, waking up with a start. "Don't panic. I heard the siren. Pensioners out first." "Podge," said Jack out of the side of his mouth. "I think the librarian is crying." "How embarrassing," said Podge. The teacher, who had been reading to the children, walked over to the front desk. "Are you all right, Mr. Goff?" she asked. The librarian sniffed miserably. "Perhaps it's hay fever," said the old man, who had now realized that the noise which had woken him was not a fire alarm. Podge and Jack joined the group now standing around the front desk. They felt sorry for Mr. Goff, but not being used to grown librarians bursting into tears in the middle of the day, they couldn't think of anything to say. The new assistant librarian, a young woman with her dark hair in a ponytail, went round to the other side of the desk and put her arm around Mr. Goff. "Cheer up," she said. "It might never happen." "It already has," said the librarian miserably. He gave her the sheet of paper that he had been reading. "Look at this note from the council." "Notice of closure," the assistant librarian read out. "The council gives notice that as from the end of this month, the Latimer Road Library will be closed." "Oh dear," said the teacher. "And that all the books will be transferred to the nearby St. Edward's Road Library." "Nearby?" said the old man. "It's too far for me to walk to." "The library staff will be given jobs in another library. Signed, the Chief Leisure Officer." "I don't want a job in another library," said Mr. Goff, his voice cracking as if he were about to cry again. The teacher put her arm around his shoulders. There, she said. "Jack," said Podge, looking closely at the assistant librarian, who was now taking off her nylon cleaning coat. "Does she remind you of someone?" "Yes, she does," said Jack. "But what on earth is she doing here?" The assistant librarian briskly peeled off the gloves in which she had been dusting the shelves. Standing there, in her purple T-shirt and jeans, she looked quite different. "It must be her," said Podge. "Who else would wear black nail varnish to work in a library?" "That's enough talk," said the assistant librarian with her hands on her hips. "It's time for action. The end of the month. That means they'll be closing the library on Friday unless we can stop them. Jack, Podge, I'll need your help. Now, here's what we're going to do." Jack and Podge exchanged glances. She knew their names. "Here we go again," said Podge with a smile. A few minutes later, the assistant librarian gathered up her belongings and strode out of the library, saying she had some spells to prepare. "Spells?" said the teacher after she had left. "What's going on?" "Yes. Who was that woman in the purple T-shirt?" asked Mr. Goff. "That was Ms. Wiz," said Podge. "If anyone can save the library," said Jack, "Ms. Wiz can. She has magic on her side." "Good old Ms. Wiz," said Mr. Goff. He didn't seem convinced. "Dad," said Podge that evening, as the Harris family ate dinner, "is it true that the council wants to close the library?" "It is," said Mr. Harris, who was a councillor. "There are too many libraries in this area. We're selling it to make flats." He stabbed a sausage with his fork. "Very nice flats they'll be, too." "What about the people who use the library?" asked Podge. "They matter, too." "Don't be cheeky to your father," said Mrs. Harris. "It's true," Podge insisted. "People need that library, and—" Podge lowered his voice. Ms Wiz is going to save it. Did you say Wiz? Is that Wiz woman getting involved? Mr Harris looked worried. He remembered last term at St Barnabas when an owl taught maths. A school inspector found a rat in his trousers and 2 of the teachers were turned into geese. That woman spells trouble. Someone's got to save our books for us, said Podge. Mr Harris dipped his sausage into some tomato sauce. Remember this, son, he said solemnly. Books are books, and business is business, and never the twain shall meet. Am I right, Mum? You certainly are, Dad, said Mrs Harris. Chapter 2. Is this a library or a zoo? That Friday afternoon, Jack and Podge met in the park and set off for Latimer Road Library. Jack brought his skateboard, because he took his skateboard everywhere, and Podge brought a large box of sandwiches, just in case saving the library carried on over tea time. But when they arrived at Latimer Road, they received a shock. The library was closed, and Mr Goff was sitting on the steps outside looking miserable. "They've locked it up," he said. "My own library, and I can't get in." "That's strange," said Jack. "It wasn't meant to be closed until tonight." "Maybe the chief leisure officer heard that your Ms Wiz had magic on her mind," said Mr Goff. "But how?" Jack was puzzled. "It was meant to be a secret. No one would be stupid enough to blab to someone on the council, would they?" "Well," Podge was looking as if he wished he was somewhere else. "Oh, no," said Jack. "You didn't mention it to your father, did you?" "You see, Podge," said Jack wearily, "you are a complete and utter nerd brain." "Perhaps Miss Wiz will know what to do," said Podge weakly. Mr Goff sniffed. "If she turns up." "She'll be here soon," said Jack. "She'll probably fly in on her vacuum cleaner." "Or just appear out of thin air," said Podge. At that moment, the number 22 bus drew up in front of the library. Ms Wiz stepped out, carrying a plastic bag. "Huh," said Mr Goff, "some witch." Ms Wiz was against giving up and going home, Mr Goff's suggestion, or smashing the door down, Jack's suggestion, or discussing the whole thing over a few sandwiches and cakes, Podge's suggestion. "The people from the council will be here soon," she said. "After all, no one has told Mr Goff what's going to happen to him." "What do we do when they get here?" asked Mr Goff. "We magic 'em," said Podge with a grin. "Yeah," said Jack. "Ms Wiz will use Hecate, the china cat with flashing eyes, Archie the owl, and Herbert the magic rat." "Oh, whoops!" Ms Wiz clapped a hand to her forehead. "I left them all at home." Mr Goff, Jack, and Podge looked at her in amazement. "All right," she said with a shrug. "Nobody's perfect." "Well, what have you got?" asked Jack, beginning to wonder whether Ms Wiz was a bit less magic than she used to be. Ms Wiz looked inside her plastic bag and eventually brought out a small bottle the size of a pepper pot. "I've got some fish powder," she said. "Great," said Podge. "We can sprinkle it on my sandwiches. Fish and peanut butter. Yummy." "And how," asked Mr Goff, "is fish powder going to save a library?" "This is special fish powder," said Ms Wiz. "All we need are some books." She walked briskly towards the library door. "Ah," she said, suddenly remembering that it was locked. "It's not your day, is it?" said Mr Goff. Ms Wiz ignored him. "Jack," she said, "have you got any books on you?" "Nothing much," muttered Jack. "Just a few Beatrix Potter." "Beatrix Potter?" Podge started to laugh. "Beatrix Potter?" Jack blushed. "They were for my sister," he said. "Oh, no," said Mr Goff as a car drew up. "Here comes Mrs Prescott, the chief leisure officer." "Quick," shouted Ms Wiz, "give me those books." Jack pulled a number of small books from his jacket pocket. Ms Wiz laid them on the ground as the chief leisure officer approached. "If you close this library down," Ms Wiz called out, reaching for her bottle of fish powder, "I shall not be answerable for the consequences." "This is no longer a library," said Mrs Prescott. "It's merely a room with books in it. We shall soon remove the books so that it can be converted into flats." "I warned you," said Ms Wiz, opening the Beatrix Potter books and sprinkling fish powder on their pages. There was a slight humming sound, which could be heard above the noise of the traffic on Latimer Road. Then One by one, a succession of small animals wearing waistcoats and pinafores came to life and hopped out of the pages of the books and onto the pavement. Soon, Pigling Bland, the fierce bad rabbit, Jemima Puddle Duck, Peter Rabbit, and several Flopsy Bunnies were hopping, waddling, and scurrying about in front of the library. "Wicked, Ms Wiz," said Jack. "What's going on?" said Mrs Prescott. "Is this a library or a zoo?" "This fish powder," said Ms Wiz, "can bring any character in a book to life." Jemima Puddle Duck was wandering off, causing quite a stir outside the newsagent. "We can bring total confusion to this area unless you leave us our library." "Fish powder?" said Mrs Prescott, stepping carefully over the fierce bad rabbit. "Right," said Miss Wiz. "Fish stands for Freeing Illustrated Storybook Heroes. It's a magic potion." Podge and Jack gave a cheer. Miss Wiz held up her hand. "If you don't leave this library alone, I'll release more characters. I can bring this road to a standstill." "You won't get away with this," said Mrs Prescott, backing towards her car and nearly falling over a Flopsy Bunny in the process. "We'll be back." She drove off quickly. "Now," said Miss Wiz, "let's get these animals under control." Just then there was a squeal of brakes from the road behind them. "Oh no," said Podge, "that's the number 66 bus. I don't think the driver saw one of our animals." "It's Peter Rabbit," gasped Jack. "Peter Rabbit? Under a bus?" Mr Goff had gone pale. "But this could change the whole shape of children's literature." "It certainly changed the shape of Peter Rabbit," said Podge, looking into the road. "He was my favourite," wailed Jack. "Don't worry," said Miss Wiz. "The fish powder will sort him out." She took a deep breath, sprinkled some powder on the pages of The Tale of Peter Rabbit, and shouted, "Hissif Redwop!" The shape in the middle of the road disappeared. Jack looked inside his book. "Phew," he said. "Peter's back." "I thought those books were for your sister," said Podge. "Never mind that," said Ms Wiz. "We're not going to be able to change the council's mind with a few Flopsy Bunnies. What other books have you got?" Podge reached inside his lunchbox. "How about this?" he said. Chapter 3. Where exactly did you meet him, Peter? Mr. and Mrs. Harris were watching television. This was one of their favourite ways of passing the time, and Mr. Harris even used to sneak home on Friday afternoons to watch The Avenue, the soap opera he liked most of all. "That Maylene's heading for trouble," he said to Mrs. Harris as he sipped his tea, waiting for The Avenue to begin. "She shouldn't be going out with that dentist when she's already engaged to the school teacher." "No," said Mrs. Harris, "not after what happened at the barbecue. Where's the boy?" For a moment, Mrs. Harris thought her husband was still talking about the dentist. Then she realised he meant Peter, their son. "Down at the library," she said. "Nose in a book as usual." "Books," said Podge's father. "Who needs books? When I was his age, I didn't go filling my head with things from books. It never did me any harm. Turn the telly up, Mum." Mrs. Harris turned up the volume on the television. "Anyway," shouted Mr. Harris, "we closed that library today." "And now," said the television announcer, "it's time to visit The Avenue." The front doorbell rang. "That'll be Peter," said Mr. Harris. He got up, grumbling. "If the bell goes at an awkward time when everyone's busy—" He opened the front door. "It's always—" "Ah, good afternoon." There on the doorstep was the fattest man Mr. Harris had ever seen. He was wearing Bermuda shorts and a baseball cap. "Can I help you?" asked Mr. Harris, nervously. The man pointed to his mouth. "Hi, Dad," said Podge, jumping out from behind the giant. "This is my friend Philip Yadzik of Chicago, USA." Mr. Harris smiled. "Howdy-doody, Philip," he said. "He's rather hungry," said Podge. "He's been in the Guinness Book of Records for the last few years." "Well, he would be," said Mr. Harris, looking puzzled. Yadzik squeezed his way through the front door. Once inside the house, he sniffed the air like a dog at dinner-time. "Would you like to watch The Avenue?" asked Mr. Harris weakly. "It's just started." "I think," said Podge, "he'd rather have a bite to eat." Yadzik pushed his way past Mr. Harris and made for the kitchen. He opened the fridge and gulped down 3 chicken pies, 2 dozen sausages, and a family box of chips, complete with plastic wrapping. "Is that Peter with one of his friends?" Mrs. Harris called out from next door. "That's right, Mum," said Podge. Yadzik was just swallowing a large white loaf of bread when Podge's mother came out to meet him. "Oh," she said. Trying to look normal when a giant is eating his way through your kitchen isn't easy, but somehow Mrs. Harris remembered her manners. "What a big boy you are," she said. "Do you go to Peter's school?" "He doesn't talk," said Podge. "Apparently characters freed from books can't talk. The words belong to their authors." "I see," said Mrs. Harris, who didn't see at all. "Where exactly did you meet him, Peter?" "In the food and gluttony section of the Guinness Book of Records. Back in 1955, he ate 77 large hamburgers in 2 hours. In 1957, he got through 101 bananas in 15 minutes. But he hasn't eaten for several years, so those records are probably about to be broken." "How was Sunday lunch?" squealed Mrs. Harris, as Yadzik found a chicken in the freezer and with great crunching noise sunk his teeth into it. "I don't think he can wait until Sunday," said Podge. "He's going to eat us out of house and home," said Mr. Harris. "Tell him to go away, Peter, please." "Oh dear," said Podge. "He's going into the front room. I wonder what he'll eat there." Yadzik sat down heavily on the sofa, breaking all its legs. He casually reached for a cushion and started eating at it. "He may eat you out of house and home," said Podge casually, "but he'll probably eat the house and home first." "What are we going to do?" said Mr. Harris. Podge had never seen his father look so helpless before. "The thing is," he answered, as Yadzik tore down a curtain and began chewing one end, "Philip used to be just a picture in a book. That was his home." "Yes," said Mr. Harris, looking puzzled. "And now someone is closing down the library where his book was kept. It's the Latimer Road Library." "Go on," said Mr. Harris suspiciously. "So, if someone could just open the library," Podge continued, "I'm sure Philip will be happy to go home. In fact, Ms. Wiz just has to sprinkle some powder on his pages and say some funny words, and he'll be back in the book. Just another weird record." "Ms. Wiz," said Mr. Harris. "I might have known that she'd be involved." There was a cracking noise as Yadzik crushed a table and started picking at the legs like a smaller person might eat chips. "I'll ring Mrs. Prescott," said Mr. Harris, picking up the phone and dialing. "Try and distract him with the television, Mum." "I wouldn't do that," said Podge. "Hello," said Mr. Harris into the telephone. "Is that Mrs. Prescott, the Chief Leisure Officer? This is Councillor Cuthbert Harris. I want you to open the Latimer Road Library. Yes, this afternoon. It's an emergency." "Now, Philip," Mrs. Harris was saying, "how about a bit of television?" "I really don't think that's a good idea," said Podge. The giant looked at Mrs. Harris for a moment. Then his eyes shifted to the television, and he smiled. "No, I'm not drunk," Mr. Harris was shouting into the phone. "This Ms. Wiz is releasing characters from books. They're everywhere. Hello? Mrs. Prescott? Are you there?" Yadzik walked over to the television, took out the plug and picked it up with a hungry grunt. He licked his lips. "Not the television!" screamed Mr. Harris, dropping the phone. "You can eat anything but that! No!" Chapter 4. Problem? Mr. Goff had never been a very brave man. In fact, he was extremely nervous. That was why he had become a librarian. Books were easier to deal with than people. They didn't answer back, or make a noise, or call you names behind your back. Excuse me. That is, until Ms. Wiz came along with her fish powder. It was all very well saving the library by freeing illustrated storybook characters. But once people from books started walking about the place, living their own lives, where would it all end? Excuse me, I say, in trouble. That's where it would end. Mr. Goff tried to imagine what Latimer Road Library would be like if this fish powder was being scattered about. Ms. Wiz had said they couldn't talk when they were outside the pages of their books. But what would happen if someone brought the history of the Second World War to life, or great whales of the world, or... A terrible thought occurred to him. The rude pictures in some of the Sunday papers. It would cause a riot. Excuse me, I say, would you mind listening? Miss Wiz, Jack and Podge continued to ignore Mr. Goff, as standing outside the library they discussed what to do next. Shh! At last they all turned round and noticed that the librarian was trying to say something. It seems to me, said Mr. Goff, that this is all getting a bit out of control. Not really, said Podge. Peter Rabbit's back in his book. Miss Wiz returned Philip to food and gluttony by sprinkling fish powder on his lines and saying "Hussif Redwop" before he ate my house. Shame about the television, though. Don't you want to save your library? Asked Jack. Of course I do, said Mr. Goff. But are squashed rabbits and hamburger-crazed Americans really going to help us? Mrs. Prescott, the planning officer, will simply call the police and that will be that. I suppose you're right, said Miss Wiz. We need to change Mrs. Prescott's mind somehow, said Mr. Goff. I don't know how, said Miss Wiz. The library's closed and we haven't got any more books to bring to life. Unless... Mr. Goff looked more embarrassed than ever as he reached into his briefcase. You can use this. He gave a picture book to Miss Wiz. Well done, Mr. Goff, she said, smiling. I was always a bit of a fan of their Majesties, he said. Podge looked at the book. I don't get it, he said. How on earth can the bumper book of the royal wedding help us? When Caroline Smith received a telephone call from her friend Jack asking for her help, she wasn't a bit surprised. Not homework again, she said. We need someone who can do voices, said Jack. You're the best actress I know. See you at the town hall in 10 minutes. Hang on, said Caroline. Who's we? Me, Podge, and Miss Wiz. Caroline gave a little whoop of delight. I'll be there, she said. It had been a very normal day for Mrs. Prescott, the chief leisure officer. The only interesting thing to happen was a rather odd call from Cuthbert Harris. Something about the Latimer Road Library and his television being eaten, which she had ignored. Cuthbert sometimes enjoyed a drink or three at lunchtime. It was probably his idea of a joke. There was a knock at the door. Come in, said Mrs. Prescott. But if, sir, help. It was her secretary, Mrs. Simpson, who seemed to be having trouble speaking. What on earth is the matter, Mrs. Simpson? Where's the chief leisure officer? Said a loud voice from next door. I'se demand to see her. The door burst open to reveal the most unusual visitors Mrs. Prescott had ever received. It's their Royal Highnesses, said Mrs. Simpson, recovering her voice at last. Prince Andrew and Princess, Fergie. They're making a surprise visit to the town hall. We're going walkabout, aren't we, dear? Said the voice coming from Fergie. Don't overdo the accent, Jack whispered to Caroline as they stood with Podge, Ms. Wiz and Mr. Goff behind the royal couple. It was lucky, he thought, that Fergie was in her wedding dress and wore a veil over her face. No one could see that her mouth wasn't moving with Caroline's words. Are you the chief leisure officer? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Prescott was hurriedly tidying the papers on her desk, while trying to curtsy at the same time. At your service, ma'am. Prince Andrew, smiling his royal smile, shook her hand. Tell me, my good woman, continued Caroline in her Fergie voice, how is my favourite library, the Latimer Road Library? I love reading. Mrs. Prescott winced. It's closed, she said eventually. I beg your pardon? Well, I've just closed it down, ma'am. My favourite library? I read my very first book there. Mrs. Prescott looked confused. I think, said Jack helpfully, that Her Royal Highness is saying that she read her very first book there. "Yeah," said Caroline. "Did you, Mum?" Mrs. Prescott was unable to hide her surprise. Somehow, Fergie didn't look as if she came from the Latimer Road area. "I demand that you open it this very afternoon." Mrs. Prescott gulped. "We can't open it," she said. "We've only just closed it. It would be a problem." "Problem?" Caroline's voice hit a new high note. "Well, if you can't open, we jolly well shall, shan't we, Andy?" Prince Andrew was still smiling his royal smile and shaking hands with everyone. He now stood where Caroline was crouched behind Fergie. He smiled and held out his hand. "Leave off, Prince," muttered Podge. "I think she's a bit busy at present." "I'm going there right now," said Caroline. "I might even mention you in my speech when I open the library." "Speech," said Jack under his breath. "I don't believe it." "Thank you, Mum." Mrs. Prescott gave a little bob of the head. "So the Latimer Road Library will be open again, all right? And stay open, okay?" "Yes, Your Royal Highness," said Mrs. Prescott. "Yeah," said Jack rather too loudly. Mrs. Prescott looked up sharply. "Sorry, Mum. Did you say something?" "Yeah," said Caroline quickly. "Okay, yeah." "Mum," said Mrs. Prescott, blushing, "may I ask Your Royal Highness why you appear to be wearing your wedding dress?" There was a moment's pause. "Because, actually," Caroline was thinking fast, "because it's my anniversary. So there." And with that, Fergie and Andrew, followed by Caroline, Jack, Podge, Mr. Goff and Ms. Wiz, swept out of the room. Chapter 5. Frankenstein comes to Latimer Road. It took quite a long time for the royal party to walk from the town hall to Latimer Road because Prince Andrew insisted on shaking hands with everyone they met. "My wedding dress is getting dusty," said Caroline at one point. "Could you be bridesmaid and pick it up for me, Podge?" "You must be joking," said Podge. "Anyway, what are you going to say in your speech?" Caroline laughed. "I'll think of something," she said. A few steps behind them, Mr. Goff was walking with Ms. Wiz. "I can't help noticing," he said, "that you don't seem to be your normal happy self." Ms. Wiz sighed. "You were right, Mr. Goff," she said. "It's not my day." "But why not? The library's going to be reopened." "If I tell you something, will you promise not to panic?" Mr. Goff nodded. "I've lost the fish powder. I think someone's taken it." "Oh dear." Mr. Goff started panicking. For some reason he started thinking about the Second World War. Great whales of the world. The rude pictures in the Sunday papers. "Oh dear," he said. By the time the royal couple had reached Latimer Road, there was quite a crowd following them. Waiting for them at the library was Mrs. Prescott, who had driven there as quickly as possible and hung a pink ribbon across the doorway. "Your Highness walked?" she said with disbelief in her voice. Caroline crouched down behind Fergie once more. "We like to meet the common people," she said loudly. "Common?" said Jack. "That's nice." Mrs. Prescott gave Fergie a pair of scissors. "If you would be so kind as to cut the ribbon, Your Highness," she said, "we can then open the library." Fergie took the scissors. Behind her, Caroline shouted, "Thanks to the efforts of your Super Chief Leisure Officer, Mrs. Prescott, and to your divine librarian, Mr. Goff, not to mention the absolutely spiffing Ms. Wiz, I can declare this library well and truly open." Everyone cheered as Fergie cut the ribbon, and closely followed by Prince Andrew and Caroline walked into the library. Soon the place was as busy as ever. Fergie sat down with a group of 5-year-olds who were being read a story. Prince Andrew shook hands with the old man who was settling back into his favourite armchair. "Miss Wiz," said Podge, "I think it's fish powder time. If you don't return the prince and princess to their books soon, Mrs. Prescott's going to get suspicious. Caroline can't keep that voice up much longer." "Now where is that fish powder?" said Miss Wiz, rummaging in her plastic bag. It could really be most embarrassing if it fell into the wrong hands. Just then, a woman fainted at the far end of the library. Standing next to her, looking slightly confused, was a ghost. "Where has Jack got to?" Miss Wiz asked suddenly. Podge shrugged. "I think I saw him in the horror and ghost section," he said. "And where's that?" "Behind where that monster with 3 heads has just appeared out of thin air." "Oh, no," said Miss Wiz. Soon the library was in total confusion, with spirits, zombies, werewolves and vampires wandering in and out of the shelves. There were screams of alarm as men, women and children stampeded towards the door. Even Fergie and Prince Andrew looked rather surprised. "Wow," said Podge. "Frankenstein comes to Latimer Road." "It's all right," Miss Wiz was shouting. "They can't harm you. They're not real, I promise." But no one listened to her. "Sorry," said Jack, ambling up to her with the bottle of fish powder in his hand. "I just wanted to see if it worked." Without a word, Ms Wiz took the bottle and sprinkled powder over the pages Jack had opened. "Hissif Redwop!" she shouted. "Hissif Redwop!" Gradually, the library was cleared as the demons returned to the books from which they had come. "I've seen everything now," said Mrs Prescott, who had turned quite white. "A royal visit, then Frankenstein in Latimer Road. I'm glad I don't work here." "So you won't close us again?" asked Mr Goff. "Certainly not," said Mrs Prescott, backing out of the door. "This is your library, Mr Goff, and you're welcome to it. Goodbye." Mr Goff turned to Ms Wiz. "Could I have my Bumper Royal Wedding book back now?" he asked. "Of course," said Miss Wiz. "Let me just put the royal couple back." She sprinkled some fish powder onto the book and said, "Hissif Redwop!" Fergie and Prince Andrew started to fade. The last Jack, Podge and Caroline saw of them was a royal smile. "What a charming couple," said Miss Wiz, giving Mr Goff back his book. "Now I'd better be off myself." "Can't you stay?" said Mr Goff. "The library won't be the same without you." "Of course it will," said Miss Wiz. "You're the best librarian I've ever met." Mr Goff blushed. "Anyway," said Caroline, "Ms Wiz always comes back. She goes wherever magic's needed." "That's right, Caroline," said Miss Wiz. "Cheerio, everyone." She held the bottle of fish powder high in the air and tapped some out onto her head. "Hissif Redwop," she said. She smiled, gave a little wave, and faded away. For the first time in Mr Goff's memory there was complete silence in the library. "What?" said Podge eventually. "That means that Ms Wiz is a character in a story." There was another silence. "And if she comes from a book," said Caroline, "then where does that leave us?" "Don't even think about it," said Jack.
That was The Misadventures of Ms Wiz by Terence Blacker, read by Helen Lederer.